Welcome back to Midnight Audit, where corporate mysteries unfold like gentle waves against the shore of sleep. Tonight, our calming story for deep sleep takes us to Houston, Texas, where towering glass and steel once reflected an empire built on numbers that shimmered like mirages in the desert heat. This sleep story will explore the rise and fall of Enron Corporation, a tale of corporate governance gone astray, where balance sheets became works of fiction, and where the brightest minds in finance crafted an illusion so complete, so mesmerizing, that even they began to believe in their own creation. In 2001, what appeared to be America's seventh largest company would crumble in mere months, revealing not solid foundations but a house of cards built on wind and whispers. This relaxing history narrative will guide you through the labyrinth of ambition, where energy traders became modern-day alchemists, transforming contracts into gold, until the financial collapse of 2001 reminded the world that gravity always wins. Before we open the ledger on tonight's audit, I often wonder where these stories travel to. A quiet bedroom in Tokyo, a rain-streaked window in London. We'd love for you to share where in the world you're listening from in the comments below, and what time your clock may show. Now, our story begins. In the beginning there was gas, flowing through pipelines like arteries beneath the earth, carrying energy from forgotten fields to cities that never slept. This bedtime story of Enron Corporation begins not with scandal, but with something far more innocent. The simple desire to move natural gas from where it was abundant to where it was needed. The year was 1985, and in the sprawling metropolis of Houston, two companies merged like rivers converging after a long journey through separate valleys. Houston Natural Gas, a regional pipeline company with roots stretching back to the 1920s, joined forces with Internorth, a Nebraska-based natural gas company, creating what would become known as Enron Corporation. At the time, this seemed like a natural evolution, a logical step in the deregulation of America's energy markets. But even in those early days, there were whispers of something different stirring in the humid air of Texas. A restless ambition that would not be contained by the traditional boundaries of the gas pipeline business. The man who would embody this ambition, who would become the first architect of what we now recognize as deception, was Kenneth Lee Lay. Kenneth Lay was born in 1942 in the small farming community of Tyrone, Missouri, where the horizon stretched endlessly in all directions, and dreams seemed as vast as the sky itself. His father was a Baptist minister and a salesman, a man who understood the power of persuasion, the art of making people believe in something greater than themselves. Perhaps it was here, in those formative years, that young Kenneth learned his first lessons in the delicate dance between truth and aspiration. As our relaxing narrative unfolds, we find Lay pursuing his education with the methodical precision of a man who understood that knowledge was power, and power was the currency of transformation. He earned his bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Missouri, then continued his academic journey to the University of Houston, where he completed his PhD in economics in 1970. His doctoral dissertation explored the regulation of natural gas, a topic that would become the foundation upon which his empire would rise. But Kenneth Lay was not content to remain in the ivory towers of academia. The energy industry was undergoing a profound transformation in the 1970s and early 1980s. Deregulation was sweeping through the sector like a warm wind across the plains, dismantling the old structures that had governed how energy was bought, sold, and transported for decades. Lay saw opportunity where others saw uncertainty. He understood that in times of great change, great fortunes could be made by those bold enough to navigate the shifting landscape. In 1984, Lay became the chairman and chief executive of Houston Natural Gas, a company that was respectable but unremarkable, profitable but not particularly innovative. Under his leadership, however, the company began to evolve, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. When the merger with Internorth was completed in 1985, Kenneth Lay found himself at the helm of what would become Enron Corporation, and with this new role came new possibilities, new dreams that stretched far beyond the humble business of moving gas through pipes. The name Enron itself was born from this merger, a combination of energy and on, suggesting motion, progress, the endless flow of power from one place to another. It was a name that would become synonymous with innovation, and eventually with one of the most spectacular corporate collapses in American history. But in those early days, as this bedtime story continues to unfold, Enron was simply a regional energy company with big dreams and a charismatic leader who believed that the future belonged to those brave enough to seize it. Kenneth Lay possessed a quality that would prove both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. He was a true believer. He genuinely believed in the power of free markets to solve problems, to create wealth, to transform society for the better. This wasn't cynical manipulation, at least not in the beginning. Lay saw deregulation as a force of liberation, freeing energy from the constraints of government oversight and allowing market forces to determine the most efficient ways to produce, transport, and distribute power. Under Lay's leadership, Enron began to expand beyond its traditional pipeline business, moving into new areas of energy trading that had been made possible by deregulation. The company started trading natural gas as a commodity, buying gas from producers and selling it to utilities and industrial customers, profiting from the difference between purchase and sale prices. This was the beginning of Enron's transformation from a traditional energy company into something entirely new, a hybrid creature that was part utility, part financial institution, part technology company. But Kenneth Lay, for all his vision and charisma, was not the kind of leader who enjoyed getting lost in the details of complex financial instruments or trading strategies. He was a big-picture man, someone who preferred to paint broad strokes on the canvas of corporate strategy, while leaving the intricate work of implementation to others. And it was in 1990 that he found the perfect complement to his own skills, a brilliant, intense, and ambitious young man named Jeffrey Keith Skilling. Jeffrey Skilling was everything that Kenneth Lay was not. Where Lay was warm and personable, Skilling was cold and analytical. Where Lay saw the forest, Skilling saw every individual tree, every branch, every leaf. Born in Pittsburgh in 1953, Skilling had grown up in a middle-class family that valued hard work and academic achievement. His father was a sales manager for a valve company, a man who understood the machinery of industry from the ground up. From an early age, Jeffrey Skilling displayed the kind of razor-sharp intelligence that could cut through complexity like a blade through silk. He excelled in mathematics and science, earning admission to Southern Methodist University, where he graduated in 1975 with a degree in applied science. But it was his next step that would truly define his trajectory. In 1979, he graduated from Harvard Business School, where he had distinguished himself as one of the brightest students in his class. At Harvard, Skilling had been exposed to the latest theories in financial engineering, the mathematical models and analytical frameworks that were revolutionizing how business leaders thought about risk, value, and opportunity. He learned about efficient market theory, about the power of derivatives and complex financial instruments to transfer and manage risk. More importantly, he absorbed the confidence that came with this knowledge, the belief that with the right tools and the right mindset, it was possible to understand and control even the most complex systems. After graduating from Harvard, Skilling joined McKinsey & Company, one of the world's most prestigious management consulting firms. At McKinsey, he honed his skills in strategic analysis, learning how to dissect companies, identify inefficiencies, and design solutions that could transform underperforming organizations into profit-generating machines. He worked with clients across various industries, but it was his expertise in energy markets that eventually brought him to the attention of Kenneth Lay. In the late 1980s, McKinsey was hired by Enron Corporation to help the company navigate the complexities of deregulation and identify new opportunities for growth. Jeffrey Skilling was assigned to the project, and from the moment he walked into Enron's Houston headquarters, he saw possibilities that others had missed. Where most people saw a traditional pipeline company trying to adapt to changing market conditions, Skilling saw the potential for something revolutionary, a new kind of entity that could profit not just from moving energy, but from the very act of trading energy as a financial commodity. Skilling's vision was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. He proposed that Enron should transform itself from an asset-heavy pipeline company into an asset-light trading company. Instead of owning expensive pipelines and power plants, Enron would focus on creating markets, managing risk, and extracting profit from the flow of energy and information. The company would become what he called an asset-light business model, generating revenue not from physical infrastructure, but from intellectual capital and financial sophistication. This concept captivated Kenneth Lay. Here was someone who could take his broad vision of Enron's future and translate it into concrete strategies and tactics. In 1990, Lay convinced Skilling to leave McKinsey and join Enron as the chairman and chief executive of Enron Finance Corporation, a subsidiary focused on the company's energy trading operations. It was a decision that would reshape not just Enron, but the entire energy industry, and ultimately lead to one of the most spectacular examples of corporate greed in American business history. Skilling brought with him from McKinsey a team of young, brilliant analysts who shared his vision of what Enron could become. They were the best and brightest graduates from top business schools, men and women who had been trained to think in terms of mathematical models and financial abstractions. They spoke the language of derivatives and futures contracts, of risk management and value creation. And they were hungry for success, hungry for wealth, hungry to prove that they could revolutionize an industry that had remained largely unchanged for decades. Under Skilling's leadership, Enron's trading operations began to expand rapidly. The company started with natural gas trading, using its existing knowledge of gas markets to profit from price differences across different regions and time periods. But this was just the beginning. Skilling saw opportunities to apply the same principles to electricity, oil, coal, and eventually to more exotic commodities like weather derivatives and bandwidth futures. The beauty of Skilling's vision, from a financial perspective, was that it required relatively little capital investment. Instead of spending billions of dollars building new pipelines or power plants, Enron could generate revenue by creating markets and facilitating trades between buyers and sellers. The company would profit from the spread between bid and ask prices, from the fees charged for managing risk, and from the superior information that came with being at the center of energy trading networks. But there was a darker side to this transformation, one that would not become fully apparent for many years. As Enron moved away from traditional utility operations toward financial trading, the company's culture began to change. The steady, predictable world of pipeline operations gave way to the high-stakes, high-pressure environment of trading floors. Success was measured not by the reliable delivery of energy to customers, but by the quarterly profits generated by increasingly complex financial transactions. Jeffrey Skilling cultivated this new culture with the fervor of a true believer. He instituted what became known as the rank and yank performance review system. Every year, employees were ranked against their peers, and the bottom 10% were terminated, regardless of their absolute performance. This created an environment of intense competition, where employees were motivated not just to succeed, but to ensure that their colleagues failed. Skilling believed that this Darwinian approach would ensure that only the most talented and aggressive employees survived at Enron, and in the short term it seemed to work. The company attracted some of the brightest minds in finance, engineering, and business strategy. These individuals were drawn by the promise of enormous financial rewards, stock options, bonuses, and the opportunity to participate in what appeared to be one of the most successful corporate transformations in American business history. As our bedtime story of corporate ambition continues to unfold, we see how Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling, despite their different personalities and approaches, formed a partnership that would drive Enron to unprecedented heights and ultimately to its spectacular downfall. Lay provided the vision, the political connections, and the public face that made Enron respectable in the eyes of investors, regulators, and the media. Skilling provided the intellectual framework, the strategic direction, and the operational expertise that transformed Lay's vision into reality. Together, they created a company that seemed to embody the best of American capitalism: innovative, aggressive, profitable, and seemingly unstoppable. Enron's stock price rose steadily throughout the 1990s, making millionaires of many employees and generating enormous wealth for shareholders. The company was celebrated in business schools as a model of how traditional industries could be transformed through financial innovation and strategic thinking. But beneath the surface of this success story, cracks were beginning to form, subtle at first, visible only to those who knew where to look. The pressure to maintain Enron's growth trajectory was enormous. Each quarter, investors expected higher revenues, higher profits, and higher stock prices. This created an environment where short-term results became more important than long-term sustainability, where the appearance of success became more important than the reality of operational performance. The energy trading business that Skilling had created was inherently volatile. Profits could swing wildly from quarter to quarter based on factors beyond the company's control, such as weather patterns, economic conditions, and geopolitical events. To smooth out these fluctuations and meet Wall Street's expectations for consistent growth, Enron began to employ increasingly sophisticated and increasingly questionable accounting techniques. This was the beginning of what would become known as Enron's engine of lies, a complex web of financial instruments, special purpose entities, and accounting manipulations that would allow the company to hide losses, inflate profits, and maintain the illusion of unstoppable growth even as the underlying business began to deteriorate. But that part of our story belongs to the chapters that lie ahead. As the architects of deception refined their craft and the house of cards grew ever higher, balanced precariously on foundations of sand and dreams, the transformation of Enron Corporation under Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling was not merely a business strategy. It was a philosophical revolution that challenged the very foundations of how energy companies operated. Traditional utilities had been built on a simple premise. They owned assets, generated or transported energy, and sold that energy to customers at regulated rates. Profit came from the efficient operation of physical infrastructure, power plants, pipelines, transmission lines that could be touched, measured, and understood by anyone who cared to examine them. But Skilling's vision transcended these physical limitations. He saw energy not as electrons flowing through wires or molecules of gas moving through pipes, but as abstract financial instruments that could be traded, hedged, and optimized like any other commodity. This intellectual leap would prove to be both Enron's greatest innovation and its ultimate undoing. For in the realm of financial abstraction, the line between reality and illusion becomes dangerously thin. As the 1990s progressed, this bedtime story of corporate transformation reveals how Enron's culture evolved to match its new business model. The company's Houston headquarters became a temple to the new economy, gleaming towers of glass and steel that housed trading floors, where young MBA graduates worked 18-hour days, their computer screens glowing like altars in the fluorescent twilight. These traders spoke a language that would have been incomprehensible to the pipeline workers and utility engineers who had built the energy industry. They discussed volatility curves, basis swaps, and spread options with the casual confidence of high priests interpreting sacred texts. The psychology of this transformation cannot be understated. Enron was no longer just competing with other energy companies, but with investment banks, hedge funds, and technology companies for the brightest talent. This created a feedback loop of ambition and expectation that pushed the company toward ever more aggressive strategies. New employees arrived expecting to become wealthy quickly. Stock options were handed out like promises of salvation, creating a culture where everyone had a vested interest in maintaining the appearance of unstoppable growth. Kenneth Lay, despite his role as the company's public face and spiritual leader, began to step back from day-to-day operations as Skilling's influence grew. Lay remained the chairman and CEO, but increasingly he focused on external relationships, cultivating politicians, regulators, and industry leaders who could help Enron navigate the complex web of energy policy and regulation. He was particularly skilled at this type of relationship building. His warm personality and genuine enthusiasm for free market principles made him a compelling advocate for deregulation and energy trading. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Skilling immersed himself deeper into the operational details of building Enron's trading empire. He recruited aggressively from the top business schools, offering starting salaries and bonus packages that far exceeded what traditional energy companies could afford. These new hires brought with them the latest theories in financial engineering, risk management, and quantitative analysis, tools that Skilling believed could give Enron an insurmountable competitive advantage. The early success of Enron's trading operations seemed to validate Skilling's approach. The company's revenues grew from $3.3 billion in 1985 to over $40 billion by the mid-1990s. Much of this growth came from the expansion of energy trading. Enron was creating markets where none had existed before, bringing liquidity and price transparency to industries that had previously operated through long-term bilateral contracts and informal networks. But as our relaxing history narrative continues to unfold, we begin to see how success bred hubris. And hubris bred the kind of corporate greed that would eventually consume the company from within. The enormous profits generated by energy trading created expectations that were difficult to sustain. Each quarter, Wall Street analysts expected higher numbers, and Enron's stock price had become dependent on the company's ability to deliver consistent growth. This pressure to perform created an environment where ethical boundaries began to blur, where the distinction between aggressive business practices and outright fraud became increasingly difficult to discern. Enron's executives began to view themselves not as stewards of a public corporation, but as masters of a new universe where traditional rules no longer applied. The company's approach to risk management exemplified this mindset. Instead of avoiding risk, Enron embraced it, believing that superior analytical capabilities and financial sophistication would allow the company to profit from volatility that frightened competitors. This led to increasingly exotic trading strategies. Enron began trading not just energy commodities, but weather derivatives, emission credits, and even bandwidth, futures for internet communications. Each new market that Enron entered seemed to validate Skilling's belief that the company could succeed in any business that involved complex risk management and financial engineering. But these ventures also required enormous investments in technology, personnel, and market development, investments that often took years to generate positive returns, if they ever did. To maintain the appearance of consistent profitability while these new ventures were being developed, Enron began to employ accounting techniques that pushed the boundaries of generally accepted accounting principles. The company started using mark-to-market accounting for its trading operations, a method that allowed Enron to book projected future profits as current income, based on mathematical models that estimated the present value of long-term contracts. On paper, mark-to-market accounting made perfect sense for a trading company. It provided a more accurate picture of the current value of trading positions than traditional historical cost accounting. But in practice, it created opportunities for manipulation that would prove irresistible to executives under pressure to deliver consistent growth. The models used to calculate present values were enormously complex. They required assumptions about future prices, interest rates, volatility, and counterparty credit risk that were inherently uncertain. Small changes in these assumptions could dramatically affect the calculated value of trading positions. And Enron's executives discovered that by adjusting these assumptions, they could smooth out quarterly earnings and maintain the appearance of steady growth even when the underlying business was experiencing significant volatility. This was the beginning of what would eventually become a sophisticated system of earnings manipulation. But in the early days, it may have seemed like nothing more than prudent financial management. After all, Enron's executives genuinely believed in the long-term value of their trading strategies. If the models projected significant future profits, why shouldn't those profits be recognized immediately? The culture of intellectual arrogance that pervaded Enron during this period cannot be understated. The company's executives, particularly Jeffrey Skilling, genuinely believed that they had discovered new laws of business that superseded traditional approaches to corporate management. They saw themselves as pioneers exploring uncharted territories of finance and energy. And like many pioneers, they were willing to take risks that more conservative managers would have avoided. This attitude was reinforced by Enron's external relationships. The company was celebrated in the business press as one of America's most innovative corporations. Fortune magazine named Enron America's most innovative company for 6 consecutive years. Business schools used Enron case studies to teach students about successful corporate transformation. And Wall Street analysts consistently ranked Enron stock as a strong buy. The positive feedback loop created by this external validation made it increasingly difficult for anyone within Enron to question the company's direction. Dissent was not welcomed in Skilling's organization, and employees who raised concerns about aggressive accounting practices or unsustainable business models often found themselves marginalized or terminated. As the 1990s drew to a close, Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling had succeeded in transforming Enron Corporation from a regional pipeline company into what appeared to be one of America's most successful and innovative corporations. The company's stock price had increased by more than 300% during the decade. Thousands of employees had become millionaires through stock options, and Enron's market capitalization had grown to over $60 billion. But beneath this glittering surface, the foundation of Enron's success was beginning to show signs of strain. The pressure to maintain growth was forcing the company to enter increasingly risky ventures. The accounting techniques used to smooth earnings were becoming more aggressive and more questionable, and the culture of competition and greed that Skilling had fostered was creating an environment where ethical standards were routinely sacrificed in pursuit of short-term profits. The stage was being set for the next chapter of our story, where the architects of deception would be forced to build ever more elaborate structures to support their illusions, and where the engine of lies that they had created would begin to consume the very company they had worked so hard to build. To understand how deeply the transformation had taken hold within Enron Corporation, we must examine the daily rhythms of life within the company's gleaming Houston towers during the late 1990s. Each morning, as the Texas sun painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, hundreds of young professionals would stream through the lobby of the Enron building, their faces reflecting the confidence of those who believed they were reshaping the world of energy, trading one transaction at a time. That the 44th floor of the Enron building housed what employees called the Bridge, a sprawling trading floor that hummed with the constant energy of deal-making and risk-taking. Here, beneath banks of glowing monitors that displayed real-time energy prices from around the globe, Jeffrey Skilling's vision of the new Enron was made, manifest in the daily ritual of buying and selling, invisible commodities that existed primarily as entries in computer databases. The traders who populated this electronic frontier were unlike anything the energy industry had seen before. They were quantitative analysts with degrees in mathematics and physics, former Wall Street derivatives specialists who had been lured to Houston by the promise of stock options and signing bonuses that dwarfed anything traditional utilities could offer. These individuals spoke in the specialized language of volatility and correlation, of basis risk and spark spreads, terms that would have been meaningless to the pipeline engineers and utility workers who had built America's energy infrastructure over the previous century. Kenneth Lay, despite his role as the public face of Enron Corporation, rarely visited the trading floor in those days. He preferred to operate from his executive suite, where he could focus on the broader strategic and political dimensions of Enron's transformation. Lay understood that the success of energy trading depended not just on mathematical sophistication, but on regulatory frameworks that would allow these new markets to flourish without excessive government interference. Throughout the 1990s, Lay had cultivated relationships with politicians and regulators at every level of government. He served on the boards of numerous industry associations, contributed generously to political campaigns, and positioned himself as one of the leading advocates for energy deregulation. His efforts were remarkably successful. State after state began to dismantle the regulated utility monopolies that had governed electricity markets since the New Deal, creating opportunities for companies like Enron to profit from price volatility and market inefficiencies. But it was Jeffrey Skilling who truly understood the mathematical beauty of what they were creating. He saw energy markets not as chaotic systems driven by unpredictable supply and demand fluctuations, but as complex adaptive systems that could be understood, modeled, and ultimately controlled through superior analytical capabilities. This bedtime story reveals how Skilling's intellectual confidence became both Enron's greatest asset and its most dangerous liability. The transformation of Enron's business model during this period was so profound that it challenged fundamental assumptions about what an energy company should be. Traditional utilities generated value by owning and operating physical assets, but Enron was proving that even greater value could be created through information, relationships, and financial engineering. The company's ability to aggregate supply and demand across multiple markets, to provide price risk management services to customers, and to create entirely new financial products based on energy commodities was generating profit margins that traditional utilities could never achieve. So our relaxing narrative continues. We see how this success attracted attention from competitors, regulators, and the financial press. But it also created internal pressures that would ultimately prove unsustainable. The quarterly earnings expectations that came with being a publicly traded company meant that Enron's executives were constantly under pressure to demonstrate continued growth, even as the company was investing heavily in new markets that might not generate positive returns for years. The natural gas trading business that had been Enron's initial foray into energy. Trading was inherently seasonal. Demand for natural gas peaked during winter heating season and summer cooling season, creating predictable patterns of price volatility that skilled traders could exploit. But as Enron expanded into electricity trading, the company encountered much more complex dynamics. Electricity cannot be stored economically, which means that supply and demand must be balanced in real time. creating opportunities for enormous profits during periods of system stress, but also exposing traders to potentially catastrophic losses when their forecasts proved incorrect. Jeffrey Skilling's response to this challenge was characteristic of his approach to business problems. Instead of retreating to safer, more predictable markets, he doubled down on Enron's commitment to electricity trading, arguing that the company's superior analytical capabilities would allow it to manage risks that frightened competitors. He authorized massive investments in trading systems, hired dozens of additional quantitative analysts, and began developing increasingly sophisticated mathematical models to forecast electricity prices and optimize trading strategies. The confidence that Skilling projected during this period was infectious. Enron's stock price continued to climb as investors became convinced that the company had discovered a new formula for generating consistent profits from volatile energy markets. Wall Street analysts who covered the energy sector began to refer to Enron as the Microsoft of energy trading, a comparison that flattered company executives and reinforced their belief that they were creating something unprecedented in American business history. But beneath the surface of this success story, subtle changes were occurring that would have profound implications for Enron's future. The pressure to meet quarterly earnings expectations was forcing company executives to make increasingly aggressive assumptions about the future profitability of their trading strategies. The mark-to-market accounting that had initially seemed like a more accurate way to measure the value of trading positions was gradually becoming a tool for managing reported earnings rather than a method for providing transparent financial information. The complexity of Enron's trading operations made it difficult for outside observers to understand exactly how the company was generating such consistent profits. Even sophisticated institutional investors and Wall Street analysts struggled to comprehend the mathematical models and risk management systems that Enron claimed were the source of its competitive advantage. This opacity was not entirely accidental. Skilling and his team understood that their analytical edge depended partly on keeping competitors in the dark about their specific trading strategies and modeling techniques. As the 1990s progressed, this culture of secrecy began to extend beyond legitimate competitive concerns into areas where transparency would have served shareholders and regulators better. Enron's financial statements became increasingly complex, filled with footnotes and subsidiary structures that obscured rather than clarified the company's actual financial performance. What had begun as sophisticated risk management was gradually evolving into something that more closely resembled financial engineering designed to manipulate reported results. The personalities of Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling during this period provide fascinating insights into how corporate greed can manifest in different forms. Lay's ambition was fundamentally political, driven by his genuine belief that free markets and deregulation would benefit society as a whole. He saw Enron's success as validation of his economic philosophy, and he was willing to take significant risks to prove that his vision of the future was correct. His greed, if it can be called that, was the greed of an ideologue who believed that his personal enrichment was aligned with broader social progress. Skilling's motivations were more purely intellectual. He was driven by the challenge of solving complex problems and the satisfaction of proving that his analytical models could outperform traditional approaches to business strategy. His greed manifested as a desire for recognition, for the validation that came with building something unprecedented, for the intellectual satisfaction of being proven right about the fundamental nature of energy markets. The enormous financial rewards that came with Enron's success were important to him, but they were secondary to the pleasure he derived from the work itself. Together, these two men created a corporate culture that attracted some of the most talented individuals in American business, but it also created an environment where ethical boundaries became increasingly blurred, where the pressure to succeed encouraged employees to push beyond traditional limits of acceptable business practice, where the line between aggressive competition and outright fraud became dangerously thin. The recruitment practices that Enron employed during this period reflected the company's transformation from a traditional energy company into something more resembling an investment bank or hedge fund. The company actively recruited from the top MBA programs at Harvard, Wharton, and Stanford, offering starting salaries and bonus structures that were competitive with Wall Street firms. These new hires brought with them not just technical skills in finance and quantitative analysis, but also cultural expectations about compensation, career progression, and business ethics that were very different from those that had traditionally prevailed in the energy industry. The rank and yank performance management system that Skilling instituted during this period was designed to ensure that only the most aggressive and successful employees survived at Enron, but it also created an environment where collaboration became secondary to individual achievement, where employees were incentivized to hoard information and undermine colleagues who might compete for limited promotion opportunities. This system worked well for generating short-term results, but it gradually eroded the sense of shared purpose and ethical responsibility that had characterized Enron's early culture. As our bedtime story of corporate transformation continues to unfold, we begin to see how the seeds of Enron's eventual destruction were planted during these years of apparent triumph. The accounting techniques that had initially been justified as more accurate ways to measure trading performance were gradually being used to smooth earnings and meet Wall Street expectations. The special purpose entities that had been created for legitimate risk management purposes were evolving into vehicles for moving debt and losses off Enron's balance sheet. The culture of intellectual arrogance that had driven innovation was beginning to blind company executives to risks that should have been obvious. To anyone with experience in traditional business operations, the energy trading markets that Enron had helped to create were becoming increasingly complex and interconnected. What had begun as simple transactions involving the purchase and sale of natural gas had evolved into a vast web of financial derivatives, long-term contracts, and speculative positions that spanned multiple commodities and geographic regions. The mathematical models that Enron used to manage these positions were sophisticated, but they were based on assumptions about market behavior that had never been tested over long periods or under extreme stress conditions. By the end of the 1990s, Enron Corporation had become something that neither Kenneth Lay nor Jeffrey Skilling had originally envisioned. It was simultaneously an energy company, a financial services firm, a technology company, and a trading house. This diversification had generated enormous short-term profits and had made Enron one of the most admired companies in America. But it had also created a corporate structure of almost incomprehensible complexity, where even senior executives struggled to understand all the ways that different business units and trading strategies were interconnected. The stage was now set for the next phase of Enron's evolution, a period where the pressure to maintain growth would force company executives to construct increasingly elaborate financial structures to support their illusions of success, where the engine of lies that they had inadvertently created would begin to operate with a logic and momentum of its own. The human cost of Enron's transformation during these years is often overlooked in discussions of corporate greed and financial manipulation. But for thousands of employees who had joined the company believing in its mission and its leadership, the gradual shift from legitimate business innovation to questionable accounting practices created a profound moral crisis that played out in the quiet moments between meetings, in conversations that stopped when executives walked by, in the growing disconnect between public success and private doubts. Many of Enron's middle managers during this period were veterans of the traditional energy industry, engineers and operations specialists who had spent their careers focused on the physical realities of moving energy from producers to consumers. For these individuals, the shift toward financial abstraction was deeply unsettling. They understood pipelines and power plants, but they struggled to comprehend the complex derivatives and risk management strategies that were becoming central to Enron's business model. Yet these same individuals were also beneficiaries of Enron's financial success. Their retirement accounts were heavily invested in Enron stock. Their annual bonuses were tied to the company's continued growth. Their career prospects were linked to their ability to adapt to the new business model that Skilling and his team were implementing. This created a powerful incentive to suppress doubts and to trust that the company's leadership understood risks that might not be apparent to those without advanced training in finance and economics. The technical complexity of Enron's trading operations also served as a barrier to understanding that protected company executives from scrutiny. When board members, investors, or regulators asked detailed questions about specific trading strategies or risk management techniques, they could be overwhelmed with mathematical explanations and technical jargon that made further inquiries seem unnecessary or impertinent. This complexity was not entirely deliberate obfuscation. Enron's trading strategies genuinely were sophisticated and difficult to understand. But it also provided convenient cover for practices that might not have withstood careful examination by knowledgeable outsiders. As this bedtime story continues to unfold through the corridors of corporate power, we see how Kenneth Lay's role within Enron Corporation began to evolve during the late 1990s. While Jeffrey Skilling focused increasingly on operational details and trading strategies, Lay positioned himself as the company's chief evangelist and political strategist. He understood that Enron's success depended not just on superior analytical capabilities, but on regulatory environments that would allow energy trading to flourish without excessive government interference. Lay's political activities during this period were extensive and sophisticated. He served on advisory committees for both Republican and Democratic politicians, contributed to campaigns at the federal and state level, and used his position as CEO of one of America's most successful companies to advocate for policies that would benefit not just Enron, but the entire energy trading industry. His efforts were remarkably effective. State after state implemented deregulation, policies that created new opportunities for companies like Enron to profit from market volatility and inefficiencies. But Lay's political success also created new pressures for Enron. As the company became more visible and more influential, it attracted greater scrutiny from regulators, competitors, and journalists who were skeptical of claims that energy trading could consistently generate the kinds of profits that Enron was reporting. This scrutiny forced company executives to become even more sophisticated in their explanations of how Enron's business model worked. And gradually, these explanations began to diverge from the underlying reality of the company's operations. The culture of Enron Corporation during this period can best be understood through the lens of what psychologists call groupthink, a phenomenon where highly intelligent individuals working in cohesive groups gradually lose their ability to critically evaluate their own assumptions and decisions. The success of energy trading had created such confidence in Enron's analytical capabilities that dissenting opinions were increasingly viewed as evidence of insufficient understanding rather than legitimate concerns about business risks. This groupthink was reinforced by the company's hiring practices. Enron recruited primarily from elite business schools and consulting firms, creating a workforce that shared similar educational backgrounds, analytical frameworks, and professional values. These individuals were accustomed to working with complex mathematical models and abstract financial concepts. They were comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity in ways that might have made employees from more traditional backgrounds uncomfortable. The compensation structure at Enron during this period also reinforced the culture of risk-taking and aggressive growth. Stock options made up a significant portion of total compensation for most employees, creating powerful incentives to focus on activities that would drive short-term increases in Enron's stock price. Annual bonuses were tied to the financial performance of individual business units, encouraging managers to take risks and pursue aggressive accounting strategies that would make their divisions appear more profitable. Jeffrey Skilling's personality and leadership style became increasingly central to Enron's corporate culture during these years. He was known for his intellectual intensity, his impatience with conventional thinking, and his willingness to challenge established industry practices. Employees who could keep up with his rapid-fire analytical discussions and who shared his confidence in mathematical modeling were rewarded with rapid promotions and increased responsibilities. Those who seemed uncomfortable with uncertainty or who preferred more traditional approaches to business were gradually marginalized. The intellectual arrogance that characterized Skilling's approach to business strategy was not entirely unjustified. Enron's energy trading operations genuinely were generating substantial profits, and the company's analytical capabilities did provide competitive advantages that traditional utilities could not match. But this success also created a dangerous overconfidence in the company's ability to understand and control complex systems, an overconfidence that would eventually lead to catastrophic miscalculations about the risks inherent in Enron's business model. As the decade drew to a close, the pressure to maintain Enron Corporation's growth trajectory was forcing company executives to pursue increasingly exotic business opportunities. The company began trading weather derivatives, betting on temperature fluctuations that would affect energy demand. It entered the bandwidth trading market, attempting to create a futures market for internet communications capacity. It invested heavily in international projects that promised enormous returns but also carried significant political and economic risks. Each of these new ventures required substantial upfront investments in technology, personnel, and market development. Investments that often took years to generate positive returns, if they ever did. To maintain the appearance of consistent profitability while these ventures were being developed, Enron's accounting practices became increasingly aggressive. The company began using mark-to-market accounting not just for traditional trading positions, but for long-term development projects and speculative investments that had highly uncertain future cash flows. The special purpose entities that would later become central to Enron's downfall began to proliferate during this period. Initially, these entities were created for legitimate business purposes, such as isolating specific risks or facilitating complex financing arrangements. But gradually, they evolved into vehicles for moving unfavorable financial results off Enron's balance sheet. Losses could be transferred to these entities. Debt could be hidden from investors and regulators, and the overall financial health of Enron Corporation could be made to appear much stronger than it actually was. The mathematical models that Enron used to justify these accounting treatments were sophisticated and internally consistent, but they were based on assumptions about future business performance that were often optimistic to the point of fantasy. Small changes in these assumptions could dramatically affect the calculated value of Enron's investments and trading positions, and company executives discovered that by carefully adjusting these assumptions, they could manage reported earnings to meet Wall Street expectations regardless of underlying business performance. This gradual drift toward financial manipulation was not the result of a single decision or a coordinated conspiracy. Rather, it emerged from thousands of small choices made by intelligent, well-intentioned individuals who were under enormous pressure to deliver consistent results in an inherently volatile business environment. Each individual decision seemed reasonable in isolation. It was only when viewed in aggregate that the pattern of deception became apparent. The board of directors of Enron Corporation during this period included some of the most respected names in American business and academia: former government officials, successful entrepreneurs, distinguished professors who had written textbooks on corporate governance and business ethics. Yet these individuals, despite their experience and expertise, failed to recognize the warning signs that should have been obvious to anyone with a skeptical perspective on Enron's claimed business success. Part of this failure can be attributed to the technical complexity of Enron's operations. Board members who were not specialists in energy trading or financial engineering had difficulty evaluating the risks inherent in the company's business model, but part of it also reflected the seductive power of success. Enron's stock price continued to climb. The company's revenues continued to grow, and external observers continued to praise Enron as one of America's most innovative and successful corporations. As our relaxing history narrative approaches the end of this first chapter, we see how the foundation had been laid for everything that would follow. Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling had succeeded in transforming Enron from a traditional pipeline company into what appeared to be one of America's most dynamic and profitable corporations. They had attracted some of the brightest minds in business and finance. They had created new markets and new financial instruments that generated enormous short-term profits. They had built a corporate culture that celebrated innovation, risk-taking, and intellectual sophistication. But they had also created a company that had become dangerously dependent on continued growth to maintain its financial stability. A company where the pressure to meet quarterly earnings expectations had begun to override considerations of long-term sustainability. A company where the line between aggressive business practices and financial manipulation had become increasingly blurred. The architects of deception had built their house of cards to impressive heights. But the higher it rose, the more precarious it became, and the more elaborate the supporting structures needed to be to prevent the entire edifice from collapsing under its own weight. The stage was now set for the next phase of our story, where the engine of lies that they had constructed would begin to operate according to its own inexorable logic. The engine of lies began not with malicious intent, but with what seemed like mathematical elegance, a solution to one of the fundamental problems facing any company that dealt in long-term contracts and complex financial instruments. This relaxing history continues as we explore how Enron Corporation's adoption of mark-to-market accounting transformed the company from an aggressive but legitimate trading operation into something far more dangerous, a corporate entity where the distinction between reality and projection became dangerously blurred. To understand how this transformation occurred, We must first examine the nature of traditional accounting methods and why they seemed inadequate for the kind of business that Jeffrey Skilling was building at Enron. Historical cost accounting, the method used by most corporations, was designed for companies that bought physical assets, used them to generate revenue over time, and gradually depreciated their value to reflect wear and obsolescence. This approach worked perfectly well for manufacturing companies, retailers, and traditional utilities, but it was poorly suited for businesses that dealt primarily in financial instruments and long-term trading contracts. Consider, for example, a natural gas contract that Enron might sign with a utility company, agreeing to deliver a specific quantity of gas each month for the next 20 years at predetermined prices. Under historical cost accounting, Enron would record revenue only as the gas was actually delivered. But this approach ignored the present value of the entire contract, which could be calculated using standard financial models that discounted future cash flows to their current worth. Mark-to-market accounting offered what appeared to be a more sophisticated approach. Instead of waiting for cash flows to materialize over time, companies could immediately recognize the full present value of long-term contracts, adjusted for factors such as credit risk, interest rates, and market volatility. This method had been used successfully by investment banks and securities firms for years, and it seemed like a natural fit for Enron's energy trading operations. The Securities and Exchange Commission approved Enron's request to use mark-to-market accounting for its energy trading business in 1992, a decision that seemed routine at the time, but which would prove to have profound implications for the company's future. Jeffrey Skilling had personally lobbied for this accounting change, arguing that it would provide investors with more accurate and timely information about Enron's financial performance. In the beginning, mark-to-market accounting did exactly what Skilling had promised. It allowed investors to see the immediate value created by Enron's energy trading contracts, rather than having to wait years for those values to be realized through actual cash flows. This transparency initially served everyone's interests. Investors could better evaluate Enron's performance. Company executives could demonstrate the immediate impact of their trading strategies, and analysts could compare Enron's results with other financial services companies that use similar accounting methods. But as this bedtime story of corporate governance continues to unfold, we begin to see how mark-to-market accounting also created opportunities for manipulation that would prove irresistible to executives under pressure to deliver consistent growth. The present value calculations that formed the basis of mark-to-market accounting required numerous assumptions about future market conditions. Assumptions about energy prices, interest rates, credit risks, and operational costs that were inherently uncertain and highly subjective. Small changes in these assumptions could have dramatic effects on reported earnings. A slight increase in projected energy prices might add millions of dollars to the calculated value of Enron's trading portfolio, while a modest adjustment to discount rates could similarly inflate the present value of long-term contracts. Company executives discovered that by carefully managing these assumptions, they could smooth out the natural volatility of their trading business and deliver the kind of consistent earnings growth that Wall Street investors expected. The mathematical models used to support these valuations were sophisticated and internally consistent. Enron employed some of the brightest quantitative analysts in the energy industry, individuals with advanced degrees in mathematics, physics, and economics who understood the theoretical foundations of options pricing, risk management, and financial modeling. These models incorporated thousands of variables and used complex algorithms to estimate the probability distributions of future outcomes. But their outputs were only as reliable as the assumptions that served as their inputs. The culture of intellectual arrogance that pervaded Enron during this period made it easy for company executives to convince themselves that their assumptions were reasonable. After all, they had access to more information about energy markets than any of their competitors. They employed more sophisticated analytical tools, and they had a track record of successful trading that seemed to validate their modeling approaches. If their models projected substantial future profits, why shouldn't those profits be recognized immediately? The accounting fraud that eventually consumed Enron Corporation did not emerge overnight. It evolved gradually through a series of small compromises and incremental adjustments that individually seemed reasonable but collectively transformed the company's financial reporting from aggressive but legal practices into outright deception. The mark-to-market accounting method served as the foundation for this transformation, providing both the technical mechanism, and the intellectual justification for increasingly questionable reporting practices as Enron's business model expanded beyond traditional energy trading into more exotic markets and speculative ventures. The application of mark-to-market accounting became increasingly problematic. The company began using this method not just for liquid, actively traded commodities like natural gas and electricity, but for illiquid investments in telecommunications infrastructure, water treatment facilities, and international development projects where market prices were difficult to determine and future cash flows were highly uncertain. The bandwidth trading market that Enron entered in the late 1990s provides a perfect example of how mark-to-market accounting could be used to create the illusion of profitability in businesses that were actually losing money. Enron invested heavily in fiber optic networks and internet infrastructure, betting that it could create a futures market for telecommunications capacity similar to the energy markets it had helped to develop. The company signed long-term contracts to buy and sell bandwidth and immediately booked the projected profits from these contracts using mark-to-market accounting. But the bandwidth trading market never developed the liquidity and price transparency that characterized energy markets. Most of the contracts that Enron signed were with other telecommunications companies that were also struggling to find profitable uses for their excess capacity. The projected profits that Enron booked from these contracts were based on assumptions about future demand for bandwidth that proved to be wildly optimistic. But by the time this became apparent, the company had already reported hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue that existed primarily in the form of mathematical projections. This relaxing history reveals how the pressure to maintain Enron's growth trajectory during this period was enormous. Each quarter, Wall Street analysts expected higher revenues and higher profits, and the company's stock price had become dependent on its ability to deliver consistent growth. The mark-to-market accounting method, which had initially been adopted to provide more accurate financial reporting, gradually became a tool for managing investor expectations rather than a method for measuring actual business performance. The special purpose entities that would later become central to Enron's accounting fraud began to proliferate during this period. Initially created for legitimate purposes such as isolating specific business risks or facilitating complex financing arrangements, these entities gradually evolved into vehicles for manipulating Enron's reported financial results. Losses could be transferred to these entities, keeping them off Enron Corporation's consolidated financial statements. Debt could be hidden from investors and credit rating agencies, and the overall financial health of the company could be made to appear much stronger than it actually was. The creation of these special purpose entities was facilitated by accounting rules that allowed companies to avoid consolidating the financial results of entities where they owned less than 50% of the equity. But Enron's executives discovered that they could maintain effective control over these entities while technically staying within the letter of these rules. They accomplished this through complex arrangements involving Enron stock, employee partnerships, and financial guarantees that gave the company the economic benefits of ownership without the legal obligations of consolidation. Andrew Fastow, who had joined Enron in 1990 as an assistant to Jeffrey Skilling, emerged during this period as the chief architect of these increasingly complex financial structures. Fastow had an MBA from Northwestern University and had worked briefly at Continental Bank before joining Enron. He possessed the kind of technical expertise in corporate finance and structured transactions that was essential for implementing Skilling's vision of transforming Enron into a financial services company. Under Skilling's mentorship, Fastow developed into one of the most creative and aggressive financial engineers in corporate America. He understood how to use derivatives, special purpose entities, and complex partnership structures to achieve specific financial reporting objectives while staying within the technical boundaries of generally accepted accounting principles. His innovations allowed Enron to pursue increasingly risky business ventures while maintaining the appearance of financial stability and consistent profitability. The partnership structures that Fastow created during this period were masterpieces of financial engineering. They involved multiple layers of ownership, complex arrangements for sharing profits and losses, and intricate systems of guarantees and collateral that made it nearly impossible for outside observers to understand the true nature of Enron's financial commitments. Even sophisticated institutional investors and credit rating agencies struggled to comprehend the risks inherent in these arrangements, but these structures also created conflicts of interest that would eventually prove impossible to manage. Fastow and other Enron executives began to invest personally in some of these partnerships, creating situations where they could profit personally from transactions that might not be in the best interests of Enron's shareholders. The complexity of these arrangements made it difficult for Enron's board of directors to provide meaningful oversight, and the financial benefits they provided to the company created powerful incentives to ignore potential ethical problems. The corporate governance failures that enabled Enron's accounting fraud were not simply the result of individual misconduct. They reflected systemic weaknesses in the institutions and processes that were supposed to provide independent oversight of corporate financial reporting. Enron's board of directors included distinguished individuals with impressive credentials, but they lacked the specialized knowledge needed to evaluate the company's increasingly complex financial structures, and they were dependent on management for information about the company's operations and financial condition. The external auditing process, which was supposed to provide independent verification of Enron's financial statements, was compromised by conflicts of interest that made it difficult for auditors to maintain their objectivity. Arthur Andersen, Enron's accounting firm, was earning millions of dollars annually, not just from auditing services, but from consulting work that involved helping Enron design and implement the very financial structures that would later prove to be fraudulent. The credit rating agencies that were responsible for evaluating Enron's creditworthiness were similarly compromised. They were paid by Enron to provide ratings that affected the company's borrowing costs and its ability to access capital markets. These agencies had strong financial incentives to maintain positive ratings for Enron, and they lacked the detailed knowledge of the company's operations that would have been necessary to identify the risks inherent in its business model. As our bedtime story of corporate deception continues to unfold, we see how the engine of lies that began with mark-to-market accounting gradually consumed more and more of Enron Corporation's operations. What had started as an attempt to provide more accurate financial reporting evolved into an elaborate system for concealing losses, inflating profits, and maintaining the illusion of consistent growth even as the company's underlying businesses were struggling to generate positive cash flows. The psychological dynamics that enabled this transformation are as important as the technical accounting mechanisms. Enron's executives genuinely believed in the long-term value of their business strategies, and they convinced themselves that temporary accounting adjustments were justified by the eventual profits that their models projected. They saw themselves not as fraudsters, but as visionaries who were being forced to work within antiquated accounting rules that didn't adequately reflect the realities of modern business. This self-deception was reinforced by the external validation that Enron continued to receive throughout the late 1990s. The company's stock price kept climbing. Business magazines continued to celebrate Enron as one of America's most innovative corporations, and Wall Street analysts maintained their buy recommendations even as the company's financial statements became increasingly opaque and difficult to understand. The mark-to-market accounting method that had seemed like such an elegant solution to the problem of measuring trading performance had become the cornerstone of a vast edifice of financial manipulation, an edifice that required constant maintenance and increasingly elaborate supporting structures to prevent its collapse. Each quarter brought new challenges as the company struggled to meet earnings expectations. Each new business venture required additional accounting innovations to justify the immediate recognition of projected profits. Each special purpose entity spawned additional entities in an ever-expanding web of financial complexity. By the end of the 1990s, Enron Corporation had become something unprecedented in American business history. A company where the financial statements bore little resemblance to the underlying economic reality of its operations, where senior executives were personally profiting from transactions that harmed shareholders, where the traditional boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable business practices had been obliterated by the relentless pressure to maintain the appearance of success. The engine of lies was now operating with its own momentum, fed by the insatiable demand for consistent growth, lubricated by the technical complexity that made oversight difficult, and powered by the arrogance of executives who believed they had transcended traditional business limitations. But like all engines, this one generated heat as well as motion, and the first signs of overheating were beginning to appear in the form of small cracks in the facade of success that Enron had so carefully constructed. The daily mechanics of Operating this engine required an army of accountants, lawyers, and financial analysts who worked in the shadows of Enron Corporation's gleaming headquarters. Individuals who understood that their job was not simply to record transactions, but to craft financial narratives that would support the company's earnings targets regardless of underlying business performance. This relaxing history reveals how these shadow ledgers became the true heart of Enron's operations, more important than the trading floors, more critical than the executive suites, more essential than any of the physical assets that the company nominally owned. The process of quarterly earnings management at Enron during this period resembled nothing so much as an elaborate theatrical production. Each quarter began with targets that had been established not by careful analysis of business fundamentals, but by Wall Street analysts' expectations and management's promises to investors. Working backward from these targets, teams of financial engineers would identify the accounting adjustments, asset sales, and special transactions needed to bridge the gap between actual performance and reported results. Mark-to-market accounting provided the primary tool for this earnings management, but its application required increasingly creative interpretations of market values and future cash flows. When liquid market prices were unavailable for specific assets or contracts, Enron's analysts would create their own valuation models that incorporated assumptions about future business conditions that were often optimistic to the point of fantasy, but which could be defended with sophisticated mathematical analysis and detailed sensitivity studies. The bandwidth trading business that Enron had entered with such fanfare in the late 1990s provides a perfect case study in how mark-to-market accounting could be used to create the illusion of profitability in ventures that were actually destroying shareholder value. The company had invested billions of dollars in fiber optic networks and telecommunications infrastructure, investments that were justified by projections of explosive growth in internet traffic and demand for communications capacity. When these projections failed to materialize, Enron faced a choice between acknowledging substantial losses or finding ways to maintain the fiction that its telecommunications investments were performing as expected. The company chose the latter course, using mark-to-market accounting to book projected profits from bandwidth trading contracts that had little basis in market reality, while simultaneously moving the actual telecommunications assets into special purpose entities that would isolate their losses from Enron's consolidated financial statements. The mathematical sophistication of these valuation models was breathtaking in its complexity. Enron employed teams of PhD economists and quantitative analysts who developed proprietary algorithms for pricing telecommunications capacity, modeling internet traffic growth, and calculating the present value of speculative technology investments. These models incorporated thousands of variables and used Monte Carlo simulations to estimate probability distributions of future outcomes. But their fundamental assumptions about market, development, and demand growth were based more on wishful thinking than empirical analysis. The intellectual culture at Enron Corporation during this period made it easy for analysts to convince themselves that their optimistic assumptions were reasonable. After all, the internet was transforming the global economy. Telecommunications technology was advancing at an unprecedented pace, and Enron had a track record of successfully creating new markets in other sectors. If the company's models projected enormous profits from bandwidth trading, who were they to question the underlying assumptions that supported those projections? This corporate governance environment created what psychologists recognize as a classic example of confirmation bias. Information that supported optimistic projections was eagerly embraced and incorporated into valuation models, while data that suggested more modest outcomes was dismissed as reflecting temporary market conditions or the limitations of competitors who lacked Enron's analytical sophistication. The company's culture of intellectual arrogance made it nearly impossible for dissenting voices to gain traction. Employees who questioned aggressive assumptions were viewed as lacking vision or technical understanding. The special purpose entities that Andrew Fastow had pioneered began to proliferate at an accelerating pace during this period. Each new business venture, each problematic asset, each disappointing investment could potentially be moved into one of these entities, removing its negative impact from Enron's consolidated financial statements while maintaining the economic benefits of ownership through complex partnership arrangements and derivative contracts. The names that Fastow chose for these entities reflected either a dark sense of humor or a complete lack of self-awareness. LJM1 and LJM2 were named after his wife and children. while others bore names like Chuko, Jedi, and Raptor that seemed to mock the serious business purposes they were supposed to serve. But despite their whimsical names, these entities were sophisticated financial structures that required teams of lawyers and accountants to create and maintain. Each special purpose entity was designed to satisfy the technical requirements of accounting rules while violating their underlying spirit. They were legally separate from Enron Corporation, but economically controlled by Enron executives. They appeared to be independent third parties, but their primary purpose was to facilitate transactions that would improve Enron's reported financial performance. They seemed to transfer risks away from Enron, but often included guarantees and support agreements that returned those risks to the company under adverse circumstances. The creation of these entities required the active participation of major financial institutions that were eager to earn fees from complex structured transactions. Banks like JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and Merrill Lynch provided financing, created derivative instruments, and served as nominal counterparties in transactions that were designed primarily to achieve specific accounting outcomes rather than legitimate business purposes. These financial institutions understood exactly what they were helping Enron accomplish. Internal documents that were later revealed during congressional investigations showed that bankers joked about the artificial nature of many transactions and expressed private skepticism about Enron's business model. But the fees generated by these transactions were enormous, and the competitive pressure among investment banks made it difficult for any single institution to withdraw from these relationships without losing market share to more accommodating competitors. The role of Arthur Andersen, Enron Corporation's external auditing firm, in enabling this accounting fraud cannot be understated. The firm was earning more than $50 million annually from its relationship with Enron, with roughly half of this revenue coming from auditing services and half from consulting, work that involved helping the company design and implement the very financial structures that would later prove to be fraudulent. This dual relationship created conflicts of interest that compromised Arthur Andersen's ability to provide independent oversight of Enron's financial reporting. The auditing teams were reluctant to challenge aggressive accounting treatments that had been recommended by their consulting colleagues, while the consulting teams were incentivized to develop innovative structures that would generate additional fee income regardless of their impact on financial statement transparency. The technical complexity of Enron's financial structures made it easy for Arthur Andersen to rationalize its approval of questionable accounting treatments. Each individual transaction could be defended based on narrow technical interpretations of accounting rules, even if the cumulative effect of all these transactions was to render Enron's financial statements meaningless as indicators of the company's actual financial condition. The culture of mark-to-market accounting had fundamentally altered the relationship between Enron's management and its external auditors. Instead of auditors serving as independent watchdogs who verified the accuracy of financial statements, they became collaborators in a process of financial engineering that was designed to achieve predetermined earnings targets. The auditing process became less about verifying facts than about crafting acceptable justifications for predetermined conclusions. As this bedtime story of accounting fraud continues to unfold, we see how the engine of lies required constant feeding. Each quarter brought new challenges as the company struggled to meet earnings expectations that had been inflated by previous periods of aggressive accounting. The gap between reported results and actual cash flows continued to widen. The number of special purpose entities continued to multiply. The complexity of valuation models continued to increase, and the risks inherent in these structures continued to accumulate. The pressure on individual employees within Enron's finance organization during this period was intense. They were expected to find increasingly creative solutions to accounting problems that were fundamentally unsolvable without resorting to fraudulent practices. Many of these employees were young professionals with limited experience. They relied on senior management to provide ethical guidance and technical oversight, but that guidance was increasingly focused on achieving financial reporting objectives rather than maintaining the integrity of the company's accounting systems. The internal control systems that were supposed to prevent accounting fraud had been systematically undermined by the complexity of Enron's operations and the conflicts of interest that pervaded the company's financial reporting process. The same executives who were responsible for establishing and maintaining these controls were also the primary beneficiaries of the accounting manipulations that the controls were supposed to prevent. The board of directors, which was ultimately responsible for overseeing the company's financial reporting, lacked the expertise and independence needed to evaluate the increasingly complex structures that Fasto and his team were creating. The credit rating agencies that were supposed to provide independent assessment of Enron's financial condition were similarly compromised. They were paid by Enron to provide ratings that directly affected the company's borrowing costs and access to capital markets. These agencies had powerful incentives to maintain positive ratings, and they lacked the detailed operational knowledge that would have been necessary to understand the risks inherent in Enron's business model. By the year 2000, Enron Corporation had become a vast financial illusion, a company where reported earnings bore little resemblance to actual cash flows, where assets were routinely transferred to off-balance sheet entities to hide losses and inflate profits, where senior executives were personally profiting from transactions that harmed shareholders, and where the traditional boundaries between acceptable and fraudulent business practices had been completely obliterated. The mark-to-market accounting method that had been adopted to provide more accurate financial reporting had become the cornerstone of an elaborate system of financial manipulation. The special purpose entities that had been created for legitimate risk management purposes had evolved into vehicles for concealing the company's true financial condition. And the culture of intellectual arrogance that had initially driven innovation had become a shield against criticism and a justification for increasingly reckless behavior. The engine of lies was now consuming more energy than it produced. Each quarter required more elaborate accounting adjustments to maintain the illusion of growth. Each new business venture required additional layers of financial engineering to justify immediate profit recognition. Each special purpose entity spawned additional entities in an ever-expanding web of complexity that was becoming impossible to manage or understand. The mathematical elegance that had initially made mark-to-market accounting seem like such an innovative solution to the problems of measuring trading performance had been corrupted into an instrument of deception. The sophisticated financial models that were supposed to provide objective valuations had become tools for manipulating reported results. And the intellectual sophistication that was supposed to give Enron competitive advantages had become a means of obscuring the company's fundamental business problems. As the new millennium began, the first signs of systemic stress were beginning to appear in Enron's carefully constructed financial facade. Small discrepancies in cash flows that couldn't be explained by timing differences, unusual transactions that seemed designed more to achieve accounting objectives than legitimate business purposes. Growing concerns among some institutional investors about the opacity of the company's financial statements and the sustainability of its reported growth rates. But these early warning signs were still subtle enough to be dismissed by most observers. Enron's stock price continued to climb, reaching an all-time high of over $90 per share in August 2000. Business magazines continued to celebrate the company as a model of innovation and successful corporate transformation. And Wall Street analysts maintained their overwhelmingly positive recommendations, even as some began to express private concerns about the complexity and opacity of Enron's financial reporting. The engine of lies had reached its maximum operating capacity. It could no longer generate sufficient illusions to mask the underlying deterioration of Enron's business fundamentals, but neither could it be shut down without revealing the full extent of the company's financial problems. The machine that had been built to solve the problem of earnings volatility had become the source of far greater instability, and the first cracks in its carefully engineered facade were about to become visible to the outside world. As our calming story for deep sleep continues through the corridors of corporate power, we find ourselves in the summer of 2001, where the first whispers of doubt began to echo through Enron's gleaming towers. The company that had seemed invincible, that had rewritten the rules of American business, was about to face its first real moment of reckoning, and the person who would sound the alarm was not an outsider, not a regulator or journalist, but someone from within the very heart of the organization. Her name was Sharon Watkins, a vice president in Enron's corporate development division, a woman whose quiet determination and unwavering moral compass would soon make her one of the most famous whistleblowers in American corporate history. Watkins had joined Enron in 1993, drawn by the company's reputation for innovation and its promise of revolutionary change in the energy sector, and for years she had been a loyal employee, watching the company's meteoric rise with a mixture of pride and growing unease. By the summer of 2001, as this bedtime story of corporate intrigue deepens, Watkins found herself in a position that many would consider enviable. She had access to the inner workings of Enron's most complex financial structures. She understood the labyrinthine web of partnerships and special purpose entities that had become the company's signature. And it was precisely this intimate knowledge that began to fill her with a creeping sense of dread. This first crack in her faith came not through dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of small inconsistencies, like water slowly seeping through the foundation of a great building. She noticed discrepancies in financial reports, questions that seemed to have no satisfactory answers, and transactions that appeared designed more to obscure than to clarify. These observations might have been dismissed by someone less conscientious, filed away as the natural complexity of modern corporate finance. But Watkins possessed something that had become increasingly rare in Enron's culture of aggressive ambition, a clear sense of right and wrong. As summer turned toward autumn in 2001, the pressure within Enron's executive ranks had reached a fever pitch. The company's stock price, which had been the ultimate measure of success for so long, had begun to show troubling volatility. Jeffrey Skilling, who had been the driving force behind many of Enron's most innovative and controversial practices, shocked the business world by announcing his resignation as CEO in August, citing personal reasons, but leaving many to wonder what deeper troubles might be lurking beneath the surface. For those seeking a relaxing history narrative to guide them toward peaceful rest, this moment represents one of those pivotal points where individual conscience meets institutional power. Watkins watched Skilling's departure with growing alarm, understanding perhaps better than most what his exit might mean for the complex financial structures he had helped create. She knew that without his protective presence, without his ability to reassure investors and maintain confidence in Enron's business model, the company's more questionable practices might soon come under scrutiny. Kenneth Lay, the company's founder and chairman, stepped back into the role of CEO following Skilling's departure, and it was this transition that would provide Watkins with the opportunity to act on her growing concerns. In her years at Enron, she had developed a respectful relationship with Lay, viewing him as someone who might be willing to listen to hard truths, someone who might still possess the moral authority to steer the company away from the dangerous path it seemed to be. Following the decision to write what would become known as the Watkins memo was not made lightly. For weeks she wrestled with the implications of speaking out, understanding that her actions could end her career, could make her a pariah in the tight-knit world of energy trading, could expose her to legal and financial repercussions that might follow her for years. Yet as she studied the company's financial statements, as she traced the flow of money through Enron's various partnerships and subsidiaries, she became convinced that silence was no longer an option. On August 15, 2001, Sharon Watkins sat down at her computer and began to compose what would become one of the most famous pieces of corporate whistleblower correspondence in American business history. Her memo to Kenneth Lay was not a rambling accusation or an emotional outburst, but a carefully reasoned analysis of the financial irregularities she had observed, written in the precise language of accounting and corporate governance that had become her professional specialty. "Dear Mr. Lay," she began, and those 3 simple words would eventually reverberate through boardrooms across America. Her memo, spanning several pages of detailed financial analysis, laid out her concerns about Enron's accounting practices with surgical precision. She identified specific partnerships that appeared to exist primarily to hide losses and inflate profits. She questioned the independence of supposedly external entities that seemed designed to benefit Enron executives, and she warned that the company's reputation and financial stability were at serious risk. The memo was remarkable not only for its technical accuracy but for its tone of measured concern, rather than accusatory anger. Watkins presented herself not as an enemy of the company, but as someone who wanted to see Enron succeed, someone who believed that addressing these problems internally might prevent far greater damage down the road. She wrote of her loyalty to Enron and her hope that decisive action could still preserve the company's future. Central to her concerns were the partnerships created by Andrew Fastow, Enron's chief financial officer, entities with names like LJM and Chuco, that had become integral to the company's financial engineering. Watkins understood these structures in ways that few other employees did, and she recognized that they violated fundamental principles of corporate governance by allowing executives to profit from transactions with their own company. More troubling still, she suspected that these partnerships were being used to manipulate Enron's earnings, creating the illusion of profitability while hiding substantial losses. As this sleep story continues its gentle exploration of corporate responsibility and individual courage, we see in Watkins' actions the embodiment of ethical leadership in its purest form. She was not seeking personal gain or public recognition. Indeed, she specifically requested that her concerns be addressed quietly and internally. Her motivation was simpler and more fundamental. She believed that the truth needed to be told, that the investors and employees who had placed their trust in Enron deserved to know the reality of the company's financial condition. The delivery of the memo to Kenneth Lay marked a moment of profound vulnerability for Watkins. She had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat, had committed herself to a course of action that would define the rest of her career and indeed her life. In the days following the memo's submission, she waited anxiously for Lay's response, hoping that her concerns would be taken seriously, that meaningful reforms would be implemented, that the worst-case scenarios she had outlined might still be avoided. Lay's initial reaction was reportedly one of concern and gratitude. He arranged for a meeting with Watkins, during which she elaborated on the points raised in her memo, providing additional details about the financial irregularities she had observed. For a brief moment it seemed possible that her warnings might prompt the kind of internal investigation that could address Enron's problems before they became public. However, the subsequent actions taken by the company's leadership would prove to be far less comprehensive than the situation demanded. Rather than launching the thorough, independent investigation that Watkins had recommended, Enron's board of directors chose to have the company's own law firm, Vinson & Elkins, conduct a limited review of the issues she had raised. This decision was problematic from the outset, as Vinson & Elkins had been instrumental in structuring many of the partnerships that Watkins had identified as questionable. The law firm was being asked, in effect, to investigate its own work, a clear conflict of interest that would later be cited as an example of Enron's failure to take whistleblower concerns seriously. The Vinson & Elkins review, conducted over several weeks in the autumn of 2001, concluded that while some of Enron's practices were unusual, they did not rise to the level of requiring immediate action. This finding provided temporary reassurance to Enron's leadership, but did little to address the fundamental problems that Watkins had identified. The review's limited scope and predetermined conclusions would later be seen as evidence of the company's unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths about its business practices. For Watkins, the inadequate response to her concerns was deeply disappointing, but not entirely surprising. She understood the powerful interests that were aligned against meaningful reform, the financial incentives that made it difficult for executives to acknowledge problems with systems that had made them wealthy. Yet she also knew that her memo had created a paper trail, a record of internal warnings that could not be easily dismissed or forgotten. As autumn deepened into winter, other signs of trouble began to emerge. Enron's stock price, which had reached heights of over $90 per share earlier in the year, began a slow but steady decline. Financial analysts who had long been cheerleaders for the company started asking more pointed questions about its business model, its accounting practices, and its long-term sustainability. The first whispers of the Enron scandal were beginning to be heard in the broader financial community. The role of corporate governance in this unfolding drama cannot be understated. Enron's board of directors, which included respected business leaders and former government officials, had been largely passive in its oversight role, trusting management's assurances that the company's aggressive accounting practices were both legal and necessary for competitive success. The Watkins memo represented a direct challenge to this trust, forcing board members to confront the possibility that they had been inadequately informed about the company's true financial condition. Yet even as internal warnings mounted and external scrutiny increased, many within Enron continued to believe that the company's problems were manageable, that its fundamental business model remained sound, that a combination of skilled public relations and gradual reform could restore confidence without requiring dramatic changes. This optimism, born of years of extraordinary success, would prove to be tragically misplaced. The Watkins memo also highlighted the broader challenge of whistleblowing in corporate America. Despite legal protections and ethical guidelines, employees who raise concerns about their company's practices often face retaliation, career damage, and personal stress that can last for years. Watkins understood these risks when she decided to come forward, yet she chose to act anyway, guided by a moral compass that pointed toward truth-telling regardless of personal consequences. Her courage in speaking out would eventually inspire others within Enron to come forward with their own concerns. Company employees began to question practices they had previously accepted, to examine more closely the financial structures that had seemed so innovative and profitable. The culture of silence that had protected Enron's most questionable activities began to crack, allowing light to penetrate into corners that had long remained hidden. As this calming story draws toward the end of this particular chapter, we see how individual acts of conscience can serve as catalysts for much larger changes. Watkins could not have known that her memo would eventually become a historical document, studied in business schools and cited in congressional hearings as an example of corporate whistleblowing at its most effective. She simply saw problems that needed to be addressed and chose to address them through proper channels. The story of Sharon Watkins and her famous memo represents more than just a single episode in the Enron scandal. It illustrates the eternal tension between individual integrity and institutional loyalty, between the comfort of silence and the difficulty of speaking truth to power. Her actions remind us that even within the most complex and powerful organizations, individuals still have the ability to make moral choices, to stand up for principles that transcend immediate self-interest. Yet even as we admire her courage, we must acknowledge that her warnings, however prescient and well-intentioned, came too late to prevent the disaster that was already gathering momentum. The financial structures she had identified as problematic had been in place for years. The cultural patterns that enabled them were deeply embedded, and the external pressures that would soon expose Enron's vulnerabilities were already building beyond the company's ability to control. The autumn of 2001 was drawing to a close, and with it, the era of Enron's unchallenged dominance in the energy sector. The first cracks had appeared in the company's carefully constructed facade, hairline fractures that would soon widen into the chasms that would bring down one of America's most celebrated corporations. The stage was now set for the final act of this corporate drama, the period that would come to be known as the unraveling, when all of Enron's carefully hidden problems would be exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. As we prepare to continue this relaxing history narrative, we can see how the threads of accountability and truth-telling, represented so courageously by Sharon Watkins, were about to intersect with the larger forces of market reality and regulatory oversight that would ultimately determine Enron's fate. The company that had seemed invulnerable was about to discover just how fragile its foundations truly were. The memo itself had become something of a legend within the hallways of Enron, whispered about in hushed conversations, referenced obliquely in meetings where its direct discussion might have been considered dangerous to one's career prospects. Yet its existence had created an undeniable shift in the company's internal dynamics, a recognition that the emperor's new clothes might not be as magnificent as everyone had been pretending. Watkins herself had become a figure of both admiration and concern among her colleagues, someone who had dared to speak truths that others had only thought in private. In the weeks following the delivery of her memo, Watkins found herself walking through Enron's offices with a heightened awareness of the conversations that stopped when she approached, the glances that followed her passage, the subtle changes in how colleagues interacted with her. She had become, whether she wanted it or not, a symbol of internal dissent in a corporate culture that had always prized unanimous enthusiasm for management's vision. Yet she also discovered that she was not alone in her concerns, that other employees had been harboring similar doubts about the company's direction and practices. The financial press, always hungry for signs of weakness in high-flying companies, had begun to take notice of subtle changes in Enron's public communications. The company's quarterly earnings reports, once models of confident optimism, now contained more hedging language, more disclaimers, more references to unusual items and one-time charges that seemed to appear with increasing frequency. Industry analysts who had long been bullish on Enron's prospects began to ask more probing questions during earnings calls, seeking clarity on business segments that seemed to generate impressive revenues but uncertain profits. Andrew Fastow, the chief financial officer whose partnerships had drawn so much of Watkins' criticism, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The structures he had created with such apparent cleverness were beginning to attract unwanted attention, not just from internal critics but from external observers who were starting to question whether these arrangements truly served shareholders' interests. The LJM partnerships in particular had become a source of growing concern among some board members, who were beginning to understand the potential conflicts of interest they represented. The culture of aggressive financial engineering that had served Enron so well during its years of rapid growth was now beginning to work against the company as market conditions shifted and external scrutiny intensified. Practices that had been celebrated as innovative when they produced favorable results were now being questioned as potentially problematic when their risks became more apparent. The company that had prided itself on being ahead of the curve was discovering that some curves can lead over cliffs. Kenneth Lay, thrust back into the CEO role after Skilling's sudden departure, found himself trying to manage a company that was far more complex and troubled than he had fully understood. His public statements during this period reflected a leader who was genuinely trying to address legitimate concerns while maintaining confidence in Enron's fundamental business model. Yet the challenges he faced were not merely matters of public relations or minor operational adjustments. They went to the heart of how the company had been structured and operated for years. The autumn of 2001 brought with it a series of external pressures that would test Enron's ability to maintain the confidence that had become so central to its business model. The terrorist attacks of September 11th had shaken the entire American economy, creating uncertainty in energy markets and making investors more risk-averse across all sectors. For a company like Enron, whose valuation depended heavily on market confidence in its complex trading operations and growth prospects, this shift in investor sentiment was particularly ominous. Wall Street analysts who had been reluctant to question Enron's practices during the company's glory days now found themselves under pressure from their own firms to provide more rigorous analysis of companies whose business models were difficult to understand. The era of taking management's word for granted was giving way to a more skeptical approach, one that demanded greater transparency and clearer explanations of how profits were actually generated. Enron, with its labyrinthine corporate structure and innovative accounting practices, was particularly vulnerable to this new scrutiny. The role of Arthur Andersen, Enron's accounting firm, became increasingly complex during this period as the company tried to navigate between its responsibilities to shareholders and its lucrative relationship with one of its most important clients. The accounting profession itself was undergoing a period of soul-searching about the potential conflicts between auditing services and consulting relationships, and Enron represented one of the most visible examples of how these dual roles could create problematic incentives. As this sleep story of corporate transformation continues, we observe how the intersection of individual conscience and institutional inertia can create moments of profound tension. Watkins had provided a clear diagnosis of Enron's problems and a roadmap for addressing them. Yet the company's response had been to conduct a limited review that avoided confronting the fundamental issues she had raised. This pattern of acknowledging problems while avoiding meaningful solutions would prove to be characteristic of Enron's approach during its final months. The employees of Enron, many of whom had built their careers and financial futures around the company's continued success, found themselves in an increasingly difficult position. Their pension plans were heavily invested in Enron stock. Their career prospects were tied to the company's reputation, and their daily work had become part of a system that was now being questioned from within and without. The psychological adjustment required to accept that their employer might be fundamentally flawed was enormous, and many simply could not make that leap. The broader implications of the Watkins memo extended far beyond Enron itself. Her actions had demonstrated that even within the most powerful and intimidating corporate structures, individuals could still find ways to speak truth to power. Yet they had also revealed the limitations of internal whistleblowing when institutional interests are aligned against meaningful reform. The memo had created a record, had forced acknowledgement of problems, but had not succeeded in preventing the larger disaster that was still to come. The partnerships that had been central to Enron's financial strategy were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as market conditions changed. These structures had been designed to work in an environment of rising asset values and expanding credit markets. But as economic uncertainty grew, their vulnerabilities became more apparent. The same financial engineering that had seemed so brilliant during good times was now revealing itself to be a source of potentially catastrophic risk. Industry observers who had long admired Enron's innovative approach to energy trading were beginning to question whether the company had pushed the boundaries of acceptable business practice too far. The deregulated energy markets that had provided such lucrative opportunities were also proving to be more volatile and unpredictable than many had anticipated. Enron's aggressive trading strategies, which had generated enormous profits during favorable conditions, were now exposing the company to risks that might prove impossible to manage. The media coverage of Enron during this period reflected a growing skepticism about corporate America more generally. The dot-com bubble had burst, revealing numerous examples of companies whose valuations had been based more on hype than on sustainable business fundamentals. In this environment, Enron's complex business model and aggressive accounting practices made it a natural target for journalists seeking to understand how American capitalism had seemingly gone astray. The regulatory environment was also shifting in ways that would prove challenging for Enron. Securities regulators, stung by criticism that they had been too trusting of corporate management during the bubble years, were beginning to take a more aggressive approach to investigating potential accounting irregularities. Energy market regulators were facing pressure to demonstrate that deregulation had not created opportunities for market manipulation. These trends would soon converge in ways that would prove devastating for Enron. As winter approached in 2001, the company that had once seemed unstoppable was beginning to show clear signs of vulnerability. Stock analysts were asking harder questions, employees were expressing private doubts, regulators were paying closer attention, and journalists were digging deeper into the company's complex operations. The warnings that Sharon Watkins had delivered in her famous memo were proving to be prophetic, and the limited response they had received was proving to be tragically inadequate. The stage was now set for the final act of this corporate drama, the period when all of Enron's carefully constructed facades would crumble under the weight of external pressure and internal contradictions. The company that had redefined American business was about to discover that some redefinitions cannot survive contact with fundamental economic realities. The unraveling was about to begin. And so, dear listeners, as our calming story for deep sleep continues through the corridors of corporate history, we arrive at that inevitable moment when shadows can no longer hide from the light, when the carefully constructed towers of financial illusion begin their slow, inexorable descent toward earth. The autumn of 2001 would prove to be more than just a changing of seasons for Enron Corporation. It would mark the beginning of one of the most profound financial collapses in American business history, a Wall Street scandal that would echo through the decades like ripples across still water. Picture, if you will, the Houston skyline in those early October days, the glass towers reflecting the amber light of dawn as traders and executives moved through their morning rituals, unaware that they stood at the precipice of transformation. The Enron building itself, that gleaming monument to energy and ambition, still hummed with the familiar rhythms of commerce. Yet beneath this surface calm, something fundamental had shifted in the corporate atmosphere, like the barometric pressure dropping. Before a storm, our sleep story now takes us into the boardrooms and trading floors where the first tremors of uncertainty began to manifest themselves in ways both subtle and profound. For months, astute observers had been noting irregularities in Enron's financial statements, questioning marks appearing like hairline cracks in an otherwise pristine facade. The company's third-quarter earnings report, released on October 16, 2001, would serve as the catalyst for what financial historians would later recognize as one of the most dramatic stock price collapses of the modern era. As we settle deeper into this relaxing history narrative, let us follow the gentle chronology of events that unfolded with the inevitability of autumn leaves falling from their branches. The earnings report itself seemed on its surface to tell a story of continued success, with Enron announcing profits of $393 million for the quarter. Yet buried within the dense pages of financial documentation lay a revelation that would send shockwaves through Wall Street and beyond, a disclosure that the company had taken a $1.01 billion charge against earnings related to investment losses and the unwinding of certain partnerships. The mention of these partnerships, particularly those associated with the name Andrew Fastow, Enron's chief financial officer, created an immediate sense of unease among investors and analysts who had long struggled to understand the labyrinthine nature of Enron's business model. These off-balance sheet entities with names like LJM and Chuco had operated in the shadows of Enron's main operations, serving purposes that seemed to blur the lines between legitimate business strategy and financial engineering designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Wall Street's reaction to this news was swift and decisive, like a flock of birds suddenly taking flight at the first sign of danger. Within hours of the earnings announcement, Enron's stock price began its precipitous decline, falling from its previous close of $33.84 per share to $28.05 by the end of that fateful trading day. This represented a loss of more than 17% of the company's market value in a single session, erasing billions of dollars in shareholder wealth with the efficiency of an eraser moving across a blackboard. The financial collapse of 2001 that was beginning to unfold at Enron would prove to be far more than a simple correction in an overvalued stock. It represented the unraveling of a complex web of financial relationships and accounting practices that had taken years to construct. As institutional investors, pension funds, and individual shareholders watched their holdings evaporate in real time, the broader implications of what was happening began to dawn on market participants across the country. As our bedtime story continues through these pivotal moments, we can observe how the initial stock price decline triggered a cascade of concerns that spread throughout the financial community like ripples expanding across a pond. Analysts who had maintained buy ratings on Enron shares found themselves scrambling to understand the implications of the partnership disclosures, their confidence shaken by revelations that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the company's business model. The carefully crafted narrative of Enron as an innovative energy trader began to crumble as questions mounted about the true source of its reported profits. The media, sensing the scent of a significant story, began to circle like wolves drawn to movement in the forest. Business journalists from major publications started making phone calls, asking pointed questions about Enron's partnerships, about the company's complex web of subsidiaries and special purpose entities, about the true nature of its vaunted trading operations. Reporters who had once written glowing profiles of the company's innovative culture now found themselves investigating allegations of financial manipulation and corporate misconduct. The Securities and Exchange Commission, that federal watchdog tasked with protecting investors from corporate malfeasance, took notice of the unusual trading activity and began making preliminary inquiries. Like archaeologists carefully brushing dust from ancient artifacts, CC investigators started their methodical examination of Enron's public filings, searching for patterns and inconsistencies that might explain the sudden loss of investor confidence. The agency's enforcement division, experienced in unraveling complex financial fraud schemes, recognized the potential significance of what they were seeing and began to allocate additional resources to the investigation. In the days that followed October 16th, this deep sleep story witnesses the beginning of a cascade effect that would transform a single company's difficulties into a broader examination of corporate governance and accounting practices. Throughout American business, Enron's stock price continued its relentless descent, falling below $25 per share on October 19th, then testing the $20 level just days later. Each milestone marked another level of investor panic and institutional concern as portfolio managers and pension fund administrators grappled with the reality of mounting losses. The human cost of the decline became increasingly apparent as Enron employees watched their retirement accounts, heavily invested in company stock, lose value with each passing day. Many of these workers had been encouraged by management to view Enron shares as a safe, long-term investment, a piece of the company's future success that would provide financial security in their golden years. Now they found themselves trapped by company policies that restricted their ability to sell employer stock from their 401k accounts, forced to watch helplessly as their life savings evaporated. The company's leadership, led by CEO Kenneth Lay and President Jeffrey Skilling, found themselves in the unfamiliar position of having to defend their business model to skeptical audiences. Press conferences and analyst calls, once routine exercises in corporate communication, became exercises in damage control as executives struggled to explain the complex partnerships and off-balance sheet arrangements that had suddenly become the focus of intense scrutiny. Their attempts at reassurance, delivered with the polished confidence that had long characterized Enron's public face, now rang hollow in the face of mounting evidence of financial irregularities. Meanwhile, as our relaxing history narrative unfolds through these October days, the broader financial markets began to register concern about the implications of Enron's troubles. Energy companies, in particular, found their stock prices under pressure as investors wondered whether Enron's aggressive accounting practices might be more widespread throughout the industry. The concept of Enron risk entered the vocabulary of Wall Street analysts, representing the fear that other companies might be employing similar strategies to enhance their apparent financial performance while hiding the true extent of their financial obligations. Credit rating agencies, those institutions whose job it was to assess the likelihood that companies would be able to meet their debt obligations, began to take a closer look at Enron's financial structure. The company carried billions of dollars in debt, much of it hidden within the very partnerships that had suddenly become the subject of such intense interest. As analysts from Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch Ratings dug deeper into these arrangements, they discovered a web of interconnected entities so complex that it challenged even sophisticated financial professionals to understand the true nature of Enron's obligations and risks. The investigation into what would become known as the Enron scandal began to take shape in those late October days as multiple agencies and organizations started their own examinations of the company's practices. The SEC's Division of Enforcement opened a formal inquiry while congressional committees began requesting documents and scheduling preliminary interviews with key witnesses. The Department of Justice, through the Criminal Division's Fraud Section, started its own review to determine whether federal laws had been violated in the creation and operation of the controversial partnerships. As we journey deeper into this calming story, we can observe how the investigation began to take on a life of its own, expanding beyond the initial questions about partnerships and special purpose entities to encompass broader issues of corporate transparency and executive accountability. Each new document reviewed and each interview conducted revealed additional layers of complexity in Enron's financial arrangements, painting a picture of a company that had pushed the boundaries of acceptable accounting practices to their absolute limits and perhaps beyond. Congressional representatives, sensing both the public interest and the political implications of a major corporate scandal, began calling for hearings and investigations. The House Energy and Commerce Committee, led by Chairman Billy Tolson of Louisiana, announced plans to examine Enron's business practices and their potential impact on energy markets. The Senate Banking Committee, under the leadership of Paul Sarbans, also expressed interest in the broader implications for financial market regulation and investor protection. The media coverage of the unfolding Enron story grew increasingly intense as reporters competed to uncover new details about the company's operations. Newspaper headlines that had once celebrated Enron's innovative approach to energy trading now questioned the sustainability of its business model and the ethics of its executive leadership. Television news programs featured segments about the company's rapid rise and equally rapid fall, using graphics and charts to illustrate the dramatic decline in stock price and market capitalization that was shocking even seasoned market observers. Financial analysts, many of whom had maintained buy ratings on Enron stock, even as signs of trouble mounted, found themselves scrambling to revise their recommendations and explain their previous optimism to clients who had suffered significant losses. The concept of analyst independence became a topic of heated discussion as observers questioned whether Wall Street research reports had been unduly influenced by investment banking relationships and the potential for lucrative underwriting fees. Some analysts admitted privately that they had been hesitant to issue negative reports on Enron due to their firm's business relationships with the company. By the end of October 2001, as autumn deepened into its final phase, Enron's stock price had fallen below $15 per share, representing a decline of more than 50% from its level just 2 weeks earlier. The company's market capitalization, once valued at more than $60 billion at its peak in early 2001, had shrunk to less than $10 billion, a destruction of wealth that affected not only individual investors but also pension funds, mutual funds, and other institutional investors who had viewed Enron as a cornerstone of the new energy economy. The investigation expanded to include intensive examination of Enron's accounting firm. Arthur Andersen, one of the prestigious Big Five accounting firms that served as auditors and consultants to major corporations throughout America. Questions arose about potential conflicts of interest, as Andersen not only audited Enron's financial statements, but also provided millions of dollars worth of consulting services to the company. The relationship between auditor and client, designed to ensure independence and objectivity, came under intense scrutiny as investigators sought to understand how such significant financial irregularities had escaped detection for so long. As our deep sleep story continues through these transformative weeks, we witness the beginning of a broader conversation about corporate governance and the responsibilities of corporate boards. Enron's board of directors, composed of prominent business leaders and academics, found themselves defending their oversight of company management and their approval of the controversial partnership arrangements. The concept of independent directors and their ability to provide effective oversight of complex business operations became a central theme in the evolving narrative, raising fundamental questions about the adequacy of existing governance structures. The human cost of the financial collapse became increasingly apparent as November began, with employees, retirees, and shareholders grappling with the reality of their losses. Enron workers who had been encouraged to invest their retirement savings in company stock found themselves facing the prospect of dramatically reduced retirement security. Some employees reported losses of hundreds of thousands of dollars as their 401k accounts, heavily weighted toward Enron stock, lost most of their value in a matter of weeks. Support groups began forming among affected workers as they struggled to cope with the psychological impact of their financial losses. The company's vendors and business partners also began to feel the effects of Enron's troubles as concerns about the firm's financial stability led to demands for cash payments rather than credit terms. Energy companies that had entered into long-term contracts with Enron started to question whether those agreements would be honored, while banks that had provided financing began to reassess their exposure to potential losses. The interconnected nature of modern business relationships meant that Enron's problems quickly became problems for dozens of other companies across multiple industries. As November progressed, this relaxing history narrative witnesses the acceleration of events that would ultimately lead to one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in American history. Credit rating agencies, responding to the mounting evidence of financial distress, began downgrading Enron's debt ratings from investment grade toward junk status, making it more expensive for the company to borrow money and creating additional pressure on its already strained finances. Each downgrade triggered additional scrutiny from investors and creditors, creating a spiral of declining confidence that proved impossible to arrest despite increasingly desperate efforts by company management. The Securities and Exchange Commission formally launched its investigation into Enron's accounting practices on October 31, 2001, marking the official beginning of what would become one of the most comprehensive corporate fraud investigations in American history. SEC staff began requesting documents and interviewing current and former employees, seeking to understand the true nature of the partnerships and transactions that had suddenly become the focus of so much attention. The investigation would eventually encompass thousands of documents and hundreds of interviews, painting a detailed picture of corporate practices that pushed the boundaries of acceptable financial reporting. Congressional interest in the Enron situation continued to intensify as representatives from both political parties recognized the potential implications for their constituents. The company's collapse affected not only its own employees and shareholders, but also participants in energy markets throughout the country, raising questions about market manipulation and the adequacy of regulatory oversight. Committee staffers began their own document requests and interviews, preparing for what would eventually become a series of high-profile hearings featuring testimony from Enron executives, auditors, and regulatory officials. The Wall Street scandal that was emerging from Enron's troubles began to take on broader significance as observers recognized the potential implications for corporate America as a whole. The aggressive accounting practices that had enabled Enron to report consistent earnings growth were not unique to that company, leading to concerns that similar problems might exist elsewhere in the corporate sector. Stock prices for other companies with complex financial structures began to decline as investors applied increased scrutiny to financial statements, and accounting practices. Across the market, as November moved toward its conclusion, the stock price continued its relentless decline, falling below $10 per share as trading volumes reached extraordinary levels. Institutional investors, faced with mounting losses and investor redemptions, began dumping their Enron holdings regardless of price, contributing to the downward pressure and creating additional volatility in the stock. The company's bonds, once considered investment-grade securities suitable for conservative portfolios, now traded at distressed levels as investors questioned the firm's ability to meet its debt obligations. The company that had once been celebrated as a pioneer of energy deregulation and innovative trading strategies now found itself fighting for its very survival, its reputation in tatters and its business model under attack from all quarters. Trading partners who had once eagerly sought to do business with Enron now demanded additional collateral or refused to enter into new contracts, further constraining the company's ability to generate the cash flow needed to service its massive debt load. The vicious cycle of declining confidence leading to reduced business activity, which in turn justified additional concerns about viability, seemed impossible to break. The media frenzy surrounding Enron's troubles intensified as journalists competed to break new aspects of the story. Business publications that had once featured glowing profiles of the company's executives now ran exposés about questionable accounting practices and potential conflicts of interest. The contrast between Enron's carefully cultivated image as an innovative, forward-thinking corporation and the emerging reality of its financial manipulations created a narrative tension that captivated readers and viewers across the country, transforming a business story into a broader cultural phenomenon. Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm that had served as Enron's auditor for 16 years, found itself at the center of an expanding investigation into professional standards and auditor independence. The firm's dual role as both auditor and consultant to Enron raised fundamental questions about conflicts of interest that went to the heart of the accounting profession's regulatory framework. As investigators examined the relationship between the two companies, they discovered that Andersen had earned more than $52 million from Enron in 2000 alone, with consulting fees exceeding audit fees by a significant margin, raising serious questions about the auditor's independence and objectivity. The investigation's scope expanded like ripples spreading across a still pond as December 2001 approached, with each new revelation creating additional waves of scrutiny and concern. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York began their own preliminary review of the evidence, considering whether criminal charges might be warranted against individuals who had participated in the questionable transactions. The prospect of criminal liability added a new dimension to the unfolding scandal, transforming what had initially appeared to be accounting irregularities into potential violations of federal securities laws. As our relaxing history narrative continues through these pivotal weeks, we observe how the financial collapse of 2001 began to affect not just Enron but the broader energy sector and financial markets. Other energy trading companies found themselves under increased scrutiny as investors and regulators sought to determine whether Enron's practices were unique or representative of industry-wide problems. Companies like Dinergy, Williams Energy, and El Paso Corporation experienced stock price volatility as market participants questioned the transparency and sustainability of their business models, creating uncertainty throughout the sector. The credit markets, those vital arteries through which corporate America funds its operations, began to tighten as lenders reassessed their exposure to energy companies and other firms with complex financial structures. Banks that had provided billions of dollars in financing to Enron found themselves facing potential losses while simultaneously being questioned about their role in facilitating the controversial partnerships and off-balance sheet transactions. The relationship between Wall Street's largest financial institutions and their corporate clients came under intense examination as investigators sought to understand how so much questionable activity had been funded and enabled. The human drama behind the financial collapse became increasingly poignant as December progressed, with Enron employees facing the prospect of losing not only their jobs but also their retirement savings. The company's 401k plan had been heavily invested in Enron stock, and many workers found themselves unable to diversify their holdings due to company policies that restricted the sale of employer stock. As the share price continued its descent towards single digits, these employees watched helplessly as their financial futures evaporated with each day's trading session, creating personal tragedies that would resonate for years to come. Our Deep Sleep story witnesses the mounting pressure on Enron's leadership as they struggled to maintain confidence while grappling with the reality of their deteriorating financial position. CEO Kenneth Lay, who had returned to lead the company following Jeffrey Skilling's unexpected resignation in August, found himself making increasingly desperate attempts to reassure employees, investors, and creditors that the company remained fundamentally sound. His communications, once characterized by the confident optimism that had defined Enron's corporate culture, now carried undertones of uncertainty and defensiveness that reflected the gravity of the situation. The rating agencies, those institutional gatekeepers whose assessments could make or break a company's access to credit markets, continued their systematic downgrades of Enron's debt as each new piece of information painted a darker picture of the company's financial health. Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch ratings all reduced their assessments of Enron's creditworthiness, with each downgrade triggering additional covenant violations and accelerating the company's march toward insolvency. The ratings process itself became a subject of scrutiny as observers questioned whether the agencies had been too slow to recognize the warning signs that were now so apparent in hindsight as our calming story for Deep Sleep moves through these final weeks of November and early December 2001. We can observe the inexorable logic of financial collapse asserting itself despite all efforts to halt or reverse the process. Enron's trading operations, once the crown jewel of its business empire, began to experience counterparty concerns as other energy companies questioned whether contracts with Enron would be honored. This loss of confidence in the company's creditworthiness created a vicious cycle in which reduced trading activity led to lower profits, which in turn justified additional concerns about the company's viability. The Securities and Exchange Commission's investigation gathered momentum as staff attorneys and accountants worked to unravel the complex web of partnerships and special purpose entities that had obscured Enron's true financial condition. Document requests yielded thousands of pages of contracts, board resolutions, and internal communications that painted a detailed picture of how the company had used off-balance sheet arrangements to hide debt and inflate profits. The investigation revealed a pattern of transactions that seemed designed more to achieve desired accounting results than to serve legitimate business purposes, suggesting a systematic effort to mislead investors and creditors. Congressional preparation for what would eventually become a series of high-profile hearings intensified as committee staffers conducted their own interviews and document reviews. The House Energy and Commerce Committee, under Chairman Billy Tozan, began planning for hearings that would examine not only Enron's specific practices but also the broader regulatory framework that had allowed such questionable activities to continue unchallenged for so many years. The prospect of public testimony by Enron executives added another layer of pressure to an already volatile situation, as company lawyers advised clients about their potential legal exposure. The media coverage of the Enron scandal continued to intensify as reporters uncovered new details about the company's operations and the personal enrichment of its executives. Stories about lavish compensation packages, insider stock sales, and expensive corporate perquisites created a narrative of executive excess that resonated with a public already skeptical of corporate behavior in the wake of the dot-com bubble's collapse. The contrast between executive wealth and employee losses became a central theme in the evolving story, highlighting issues of corporate responsibility and fiduciary duty that would shape public discourse for years to come. As we approach the climactic conclusion of this portion of our bedtime story, the Wall Street scandal that had begun with questions about accounting irregularities had evolved into a comprehensive examination of American corporate governance. The Enron collapse was no longer simply a business story, but had become a cultural phenomenon that reflected broader concerns about fairness, transparency, and accountability in corporate America. The company's rapid descent from market darling to regulatory pariah served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of effective oversight in maintaining public trust in financial markets. And so, dear listeners, as this chapter of our relaxing history narrative draws to its inevitable close, we prepare to witness how the complete collapse of this corporate giant would send shockwaves throughout the American economy and reshape the regulatory landscape for generations to come. The aftermath of Enron's fall would prove to be even more far-reaching than the collapse itself, touching every aspect of corporate governance, accounting standards, and investor protection. As we transition into this next phase of our story, we shall explore how the rubble of one company's spectacular failure would become the foundation for a new era of corporate accountability and regulatory reform. And so, dear listeners, as our bedtime story continues through this dark chapter of corporate history, we witness the inevitable transformation of financial scandal into human tragedy, where the abstract numbers on balance sheets became the very real losses experienced by thousands of ordinary people who had trusted their futures to a company that had built its empire on shifting foundations. The aftermath of Enron's collapse would prove to be far more devastating than even the most pessimistic observers had anticipated, creating ripples of consequence that would spread throughout American society like stones thrown into still water, each circle expanding outward to touch lives in ways both expected and profound. The dawn of December 2nd of 2001 brought with it the formal announcement that would forever change the landscape of American business. Enron Corporation, once valued at more than $70 billion and employing over 20,000 people worldwide, filed for bankruptcy protection under Chapter 11 of the Federal Bankruptcy Code, marking the largest corporate failure in American history up to that point. The filing, submitted to the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York, represented not merely the end of a company, but the beginning of a reckoning that would expose the depth of corporate fraud and white-collar crime that had flourished in the shadows of America's energy markets. As we settle deeper into this calming story, we can observe how the bankruptcy filing unleashed a cascade of investigations and legal proceedings that would consume the next several years. Federal prosecutors, SEC investigators, congressional committees, and bankruptcy trustees all began their methodical examination of Enron's records, each seeking to understand how such a massive deception had been perpetrated and maintained for so long. The sheer volume of documents involved in these investigations would eventually fill entire warehouses, creating a paper trail that chronicled one of the most sophisticated schemes of financial manipulation ever uncovered. Arthur Andersen, the venerable accounting firm that had served as Enron's auditor for 16 years, found itself facing an existential crisis as questions mounted about its role in enabling the corporate fraud that had devastated so many lives. The firm, founded in 1913 and long regarded as one of the pillars of the accounting profession, now faced accusations that it had not only failed to detect Enron's financial manipulations, but had actively participated in creating and concealing them. The relationship between auditor and client, meant to provide independent verification of financial statements, had apparently become so compromised that Arthur Andersen had lost sight of its fundamental responsibility to investors and the public. The human cost of Enron's collapse began to manifest itself in ways both immediate and lasting as December progressed, with thousands of employees receiving termination notices just weeks before Christmas. These workers, many of whom had devoted their entire careers to building what they believed was an innovative and successful company, now found themselves not only unemployed, but facing the reality that their retirement savings, heavily invested in Enron stock, had virtually disappeared overnight. The company's 401k plan, which had once been a source of pride and financial security, had become a symbol of misplaced trust and shattered dreams. Our relaxing history narrative now takes us into the lives of these affected employees, whose stories would become emblematic of the broader tragedy that corporate malfeasance can inflict upon ordinary people. Secretaries who had worked loyally for decades watched their retirement accounts shrink from six figures to mere thousands of dollars. Engineers and traders who had believed they were part of an energy revolution found themselves struggling to explain to potential employers how their experience at Enron might be viewed in a job market, suddenly suspicious of anyone associated with a failed company. Maintenance workers, security guards, and cafeteria staff, people whose connection to the complex financial schemes was non-existent, nonetheless found their livelihoods destroyed by decisions made in boardrooms they had never entered. The investigation into Arthur Andersen's conduct intensified as federal prosecutors examined evidence, suggesting that the accounting firm had not only failed in its auditing responsibilities but had actively obstructed justice by destroying documents related to its Enron work. On January 10, 2002, David Duncan, the Arthur Andersen partner who had overseen the Enron audit, invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination when called to testify before Congress, a decision that further damaged the firm's reputation and fueled speculation about the extent of its involvement in the scandal. As our deep sleep story continues through these winter months, we witness the systematic unraveling of one of America's most prestigious accounting firms. Arthur Andersen had built its reputation over nearly 9 decades of providing audit services to major corporations, earning trust through its supposed commitment to independence and professional integrity. Now that reputation crumbled as investigators discovered evidence of document destruction, conflicts of interest, and a culture within the firm that had prioritized client relationships over professional responsibilities. The Department of Justice, recognizing the unprecedented nature of the case and its potential impact on public confidence in financial markets, assigned a team of experienced prosecutors to pursue criminal charges against both Enron executives and Arthur Andersen personnel. The investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that suggested corporate fraud on a scale never before seen in American business. With billions of dollars in debt hidden from investors, revenues inflated through sham transactions, and profits manipulated through the creative use of off-balance sheet partnerships that existed, primarily to deceive rather than to serve legitimate business purposes. Congressional hearings that began in December 2001 and continued through much of 2002 provided a public forum for examining not only the specific failures at Enron and Arthur Andersen, but also the broader systemic weaknesses that had allowed such massive fraud to flourish undetected. The House Energy and Commerce Committee, led by Chairman Billy Tauzin, conducted extensive hearings that featured testimony from former Enron executives, Arthur Andersen partners, and employees whose lives had been devastated by the scandal. These hearings, broadcast live on television and covered extensively by print media, brought the human cost of white-collar crime into American living rooms with unprecedented clarity. The testimony of Sharon Watkins, the Enron vice president who had warned CEO Kenneth Lay about accounting irregularities months before the company's collapse, became one of the defining moments of the congressional investigation. Her detailed account of how she had attempted to raise concerns about the company's financial practices, only to see those concerns dismissed or ignored, illustrated the challenges faced by employees who tried to speak out against corporate wrongdoing. Watkins became a symbol of the courage required to challenge powerful interests, even when doing so placed one's career and personal safety at risk. As winter turned to spring in 2002, our bedtime story witnesses the formal indictment of Arthur Andersen on charges of obstruction of justice related to the destruction of Enron-related documents. The indictment, handed down by a federal grand jury in Houston on March 14, 2002, marked the first time in history that one of the major accounting firms had faced criminal charges. The indictment alleged that Arthur Andersen had engaged in a systematic effort to destroy documents and delete computer files that might have revealed the extent of Enron's financial manipulation, thereby obstructing the SEC's investigation and congressional inquiries. The trial of Arthur Andersen, which began in May 2002, provided a detailed examination of the relationship between the accounting firm and its most prominent client. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that Arthur Andersen personnel had shredded thousands of documents and deleted hundreds of computer files in the weeks following the announcement of the SEC investigation. The defense argued that such document destruction was part of normal business practices and that there had been no intent to obstruct justice, but the evidence painted a picture of a firm that had prioritized its own interests over its professional obligations. The human cost of the scandal continued to mount as former Enron employees struggled to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of the company's collapse. Many found that their association with Enron made them virtually unemployable in the energy industry, as other companies feared the reputational risk of hiring anyone connected to the scandal. Support groups formed among former employees as they grappled with the psychological impact of losing not only their jobs, but also their professional identities and financial security. Some employees reported symptoms of depression and anxiety as they came to terms with the magnitude of their losses and the betrayal of trust they had experienced. The bankruptcy proceedings, overseen by Judge Arthur Gonzalez, revealed the true extent of Enron's financial deception as court-appointed examiners dissected the company's complex web of subsidiaries and partnerships. The investigation uncovered billions of dollars in hidden debt, inflated revenues, and manipulated earnings that had been used to create an illusion of profitability and growth. The complexity of Enron's financial structure was so great that it took teams of accountants and lawyers months to unravel the various transactions and determine the company's actual financial condition as our calming story moves. Through the spring and summer of 2002, we observed the gradual emergence of criminal charges against individual Enron executives. Jeffrey Skilling, the former president and CEO who had resigned unexpectedly in August 2001, was indicted on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and insider trading. Kenneth Lay, the company's founder and chairman, faced similar charges related to his role in perpetuating the fraud and misleading investors about the company's true financial condition. Andrew Fastow, the chief financial officer who had masterminded many of the off-balance sheet partnerships, was charged with multiple counts of conspiracy and fraud. The conviction of Arthur Andersen on June 15, 2002, marked a watershed moment in the history of American business. The jury found that the accounting firm had indeed obstructed justice by destroying documents related to its Enron audit, making Arthur Andersen the first major accounting firm ever to be convicted of a felony. The conviction effectively ended the firm's ability to audit public companies, as federal regulations prohibited convicted felons from serving as auditors for publicly traded corporations. The collapse of Arthur Andersen sent shockwaves throughout the accounting profession and raised fundamental questions about the independence and integrity of corporate auditing. The firm, which had employed 85,000 people worldwide and had been responsible for auditing hundreds of major corporations, essentially ceased to exist within months of its conviction. Thousands of Arthur Andersen employees, many of whom had no involvement in the Enron engagement, found themselves unemployed and struggling to find positions with other accounting firms. As summer turned to autumn in 2002, our relaxing history narrative witnesses the beginning of individual trials for former Enron executives, each proceeding revealing new details about the extent of the corporate fraud that had devastated so many lives. The trial of Andrew Fastow, which began in 2004, provided the most detailed examination of the off-balance sheet partnerships that had been used to hide debt and inflate earnings. Fastow's testimony revealed a culture within Enron that had rewarded financial engineering over legitimate business activities, with executives receiving bonuses and promotions based on their ability to create complex transactions that improved reported financial results regardless of their economic substance. The human cost of white-collar crime became increasingly apparent as the trials proceeded, with victims' impact statements revealing the devastating personal consequences of the executives' actions. Former employees described losing their homes, being unable to afford their children's college educations, and facing health problems caused by the stress of financial ruin. Retirees who had invested their life savings in Enron stock spoke of having to return to work in their 70s and 80s to make ends meet. The elderly parents of Enron employees described watching their children struggle with depression and anxiety as they attempted to rebuild their lives after losing everything they had worked for. The trial of Jeffrey Skilling, which began in January 2006, provided perhaps the most comprehensive examination of Enron's corporate culture and business practices. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that Skilling had been aware of the company's financial problems for years, but had continued to make public statements suggesting that the business was healthy and growing. The testimony revealed a pattern of deception that extended from the highest levels of management down through various divisions of the company, with employees being pressured to meet unrealistic financial targets through whatever means necessary. As our deep sleep story continues through these legal proceedings, we can observe how the trials serve not only as a means of achieving justice for the victims, but also as a form of public education about the dangers of unchecked corporate power. The extensive media coverage of the proceedings brought the complex world of corporate finance and accounting into public view, helping ordinary citizens understand how sophisticated financial schemes could be used to deceive investors and manipulate markets. The trials became a cautionary tale about the importance of ethical leadership and the need for effective oversight of corporate behavior. The conviction of Jeffrey Skilling on multiple counts of conspiracy, fraud, and insider trading in May 2006 represented a significant victory for federal prosecutors and a measure of justice for the thousands of people whose lives had been devastated by Enron's collapse. Skilling was sentenced to 24 years in federal prison, a term that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the magnitude of harm he had caused. The sentence sent a clear message that white-collar criminals would face serious consequences for their actions, even when those actions were carried out from corporate boardrooms rather than back alleys. The trial and conviction of Kenneth Lay, which occurred simultaneously with Skilling's prosecution, provided closure for many of the scandal's victims who had seen Lay as the ultimate symbol of corporate greed and deception. Lay, who had founded Enron and served as its public face for many years, was found guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy and fraud. However, his death from a heart attack in July 2006, just months after his conviction, meant that he never served any prison time for his crimes, a fact that left many victims feeling that complete justice had not been achieved. The aftermath of the Enron scandal extended far beyond the courtroom, as Congress and federal regulators implemented sweeping reforms designed to prevent similar fraud in the future. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, signed into law by President Bush in July 2002, represented the most significant overhaul of securities law since the 1930s, establishing new requirements for corporate governance, internal controls, and executive accountability. The law required CEOs and CFOs to personally certify the accuracy of their company's financial statements, created new penalties for securities fraud, and established enhanced independence requirements for corporate auditors. As our bedtime story moves through the years following Enron's collapse, we witness the gradual healing process experienced by many of the scandal's victims. Former employees, with the help of support groups and counseling services, slowly began to rebuild their lives and careers. Many found new employment in different industries, while others started their own businesses or returned to school to develop new skills. The resilience and determination displayed by these individuals served as a testament to the human capacity for recovery even in the face of devastating loss. The settlement of various civil lawsuits related to the scandal provided some measure of financial compensation for victims, though the amounts recovered were often only a fraction of what had been lost. The largest settlement, reached with various banks that had helped facilitate Enron's complex transactions, totaled more than $7 billion and was distributed to shareholders who had lost money when the company collapsed. While these settlements could not fully compensate victims for their losses, they provided some resources to help rebuild lives and served as a deterrent to other financial institutions that might consider participating in similar schemes. The impact of the scandal on the accounting profession was profound and lasting, leading to significant changes in how auditors approach their work and interact with clients. New independence requirements prohibited accounting firms from providing certain consulting services to their audit clients, while enhanced oversight by the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board created additional layers of supervision and accountability. The collapse of Arthur Andersen served as a stark reminder of the importance of maintaining professional independence and integrity, even in the face of pressure from lucrative clients. As we approach the conclusion of this portion of our calming story, we can reflect on how the human cost of corporate fraud extends far beyond the immediate victims to include families, communities, and society as a whole. The thousands of Enron employees who lost their jobs and retirement savings were not the only ones affected by the scandal. Their spouses and children also suffered as families struggled to cope with financial hardship and emotional trauma. Local communities in Houston and other cities where Enron had major operations experienced economic disruption as the company's collapse eliminated thousands of jobs and reduced tax revenues. The educational impact of the Enron scandal has been significant, with business schools and ethics programs using the case as a teaching tool to help future leaders understand the importance of ethical decision-making and corporate responsibility. The scandal has become a standard case study in courses on business ethics, corporate governance, and accounting, helping to ensure that future generations of business leaders are aware of the consequences of placing short-term profits ahead of long-term sustainability and stakeholder interest. The psychological impact of the scandal on public trust in corporations and financial markets has been lasting and profound. Surveys conducted in the years following Enron's collapse consistently showed reduced confidence in corporate leadership and increased skepticism about the accuracy of financial reporting. This erosion of trust has had real economic consequences, as investors have demanded higher risk premiums and more extensive disclosure from public companies, ultimately increasing the cost of capital for legitimate businesses. And so, dear listeners, as this chapter of our relaxing history narrative draws toward its close, we prepare to examine how the legacy of Enron's lies would continue to shape American business and society long after the trials had ended and the headlines had faded. The aftermath of the scandal would prove to be not merely a period of punishment and recovery, but a time of fundamental transformation in how Americans viewed corporate power and responsibility. The lessons learned from this devastating episode would influence regulatory policy, corporate governance practices, and public expectations for decades to come, creating a lasting legacy that extends far beyond the specific individuals and institutions that were directly involved in the fraud. As we transition into our final exploration of this remarkable story, we shall discover how the ashes of one company's spectacular deception became the foundation for a new era of corporate accountability and transparency. The ripple effects of Arthur Andersen's destruction continued to reverberate throughout the global accounting profession as the firm's international offices struggled to maintain their operations in the wake of the criminal conviction. Offices in London, Frankfurt, and Tokyo that had operated under the Arthur Andersen name for decades found themselves forced to merge with other accounting firms or cease operations entirely. The human cost of the firm's collapse extended to tens of thousands of employees worldwide who had dedicated their careers to building what they believed was an institution of professional integrity and excellence. The investigation into the document destruction at Arthur Andersen revealed a systematic effort to eliminate evidence that might have exposed the full extent of Enron's financial manipulation. Federal prosecutors presented evidence showing that firm personnel had worked around the clock in the weeks following the SEC's announcement of its investigation, feeding thousands of documents into shredders and deleting computer files that might have provided crucial evidence about the firm's knowledge of Enron's fraudulent practices. The scale of the destruction was so extensive that it took investigators months to piece together even fragments of what had been lost. As our calming story continues through 2003 and 2004, we witness the gradual emergence of individual accountability as prosecutors methodically built cases against the executives who had orchestrated the massive fraud. The investigation revealed that the corporate fraud at Enron had not been the work of a single individual, but rather a conspiracy involving dozens of executives, accountants, and lawyers who had worked together to create and maintain the illusion of corporate success while enriching themselves at the expense of employees and investors. The plea agreement, reached with Andrew Fastow in January 2004, provided prosecutors with unprecedented insight into the inner workings of Enron's financial manipulation schemes. Fastow's cooperation revealed details about how the off-balance sheet partnerships had been structured not just to hide debt, but to generate millions of dollars in management fees for Fastow and his associates. His testimony would later become crucial in securing convictions against other Enron executives, as he provided insider knowledge about meetings, conversations, and decisions that had previously been known only to the participants. The human cost of the scandal continued to unfold in courtrooms and bankruptcy proceedings as victims struggled to recover even small portions of their losses. Class action lawsuits filed on behalf of shareholders and employees revealed the devastating personal impact of the fraud, with victims describing how they had lost homes, been forced into bankruptcy, and seen their children's educational opportunities disappear along with their Enron stock. Elderly investors spoke of having to choose between medication and food as their retirement savings evaporated, while middle-aged employees described the humiliation of having to move in with adult children after losing everything they had worked to build. The investigation into white-collar crime at Enron expanded beyond the company itself to include examination of the banks and financial institutions that had facilitated the complex transactions used to hide debt and inflate earnings. Major Wall Street firms including Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, and Merrill Lynch faced scrutiny for their roles in creating and marketing the structured finance products that had enabled Enron's deception. The investigation revealed that these institutions had not only provided financing for questionable transactions, but had also helped design the very structures that were used to mislead investors and regulators. As our deep sleep story moves through the mid-2000s, we observe how the trials of individual executives provided a forum for examining the broader culture of corporate greed and ethical compromise that had flourished during the late 1990s and early 2000s. The testimony revealed a business environment in which executives were rewarded for meeting quarterly earnings targets regardless of the methods used to achieve those results. Employees described feeling pressure to participate in questionable transactions or risk losing their jobs, while executives spoke of a culture in which challenging superiors or questioning unethical practices was seen as a sign of disloyalty. The conviction of multiple Enron executives sent a clear message that white-collar crime would not go unpunished. Even when committed by individuals with wealth, power, and political connections, the sentences imposed on these executives, ranging from several years to more than 2 decades in federal prison, represented some of the harshest penalties ever imposed for corporate fraud. The message to corporate America was unmistakable. Those who chose to enrich themselves through deception and fraud would face serious consequences that could include not only financial penalties but also the loss of freedom and reputation. The impact of the scandal on regulatory oversight was immediate and comprehensive, with federal agencies implementing new rules and procedures designed to prevent similar fraud in the future. The Securities and Exchange Commission expanded its enforcement division and hired additional investigators with specialized expertise in complex financial transactions. The agency also implemented new requirements for executive certification of financial statements and enhanced disclosure of off-balance sheet arrangements, making it more difficult for companies to hide debt or inflate earnings through questionable accounting practices. The creation of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board marked a fundamental shift in how the accounting profession was regulated and supervised. This new federal agency, established by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, was given broad authority to inspect accounting firms, investigate misconduct, and impose sanctions on auditors who failed to meet professional standards. The board's creation represented a recognition that self-regulation by the accounting profession had proven inadequate to protect investors and maintain public confidence in financial reporting. As our relaxing history narrative continues through the aftermath of the scandal, we witness the gradual process of institutional learning and reform that emerged from the ashes of Enron's collapse. Business schools began incorporating ethics training into their curricula, while corporate boards implemented new governance practices designed to ensure greater independence and oversight. The scandal became a case study that would be taught to future generations of business leaders, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing short-term profits over long-term sustainability and stakeholder interests. The settlement negotiations that took place over several years resulted in billions of dollars in compensation for victims, though the amounts recovered represented only a fraction of the total losses suffered. The complexity of determining damages in such cases was enormous, as courts had to consider not only direct financial losses, but also the opportunity costs associated with investments that might have been made if accurate information had been available. The process of distributing settlement funds among thousands of victims proved to be a logistical challenge that took years to complete and often left individual recipients feeling that their compensation was inadequate given the magnitude of their losses. The psychological support services that emerged in response to the scandal revealed the depth of emotional trauma experienced by victims of corporate fraud. Mental health professionals who worked with former Enron employees reported high rates of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress among individuals who had lost not only their financial security, but also their sense of identity and purpose. Support groups that formed organically among victims provided crucial emotional support and practical assistance as individuals worked to rebuild their lives and careers. The investigation into the role of credit rating agencies in the scandal revealed another systemic weakness in the financial oversight system. Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch Ratings had all maintained investment-grade ratings on Enron's debt until just days before the company's bankruptcy, despite warning signs that had been apparent to other market participants for months. The investigation revealed conflicts of interest within the rating agencies, which were paid by the companies whose debt they rated, creating incentives to maintain favorable ratings even when financial conditions were deteriorating. As our bedtime story progresses through the years of legal proceedings and recovery efforts, we observe how the scandal fundamentally changed public expectations about corporate behavior and accountability. Opinion polls conducted in the aftermath of Enron's collapse showed a significant decline in public trust in corporate leadership and a corresponding increase in support for stronger regulatory oversight. This shift in public sentiment provided political support for the comprehensive reforms that were implemented in the years following the scandal. The impact on the energy industry was particularly severe, as Enron's collapse called into question the entire model of energy deregulation and trading that had been promoted as a solution to inefficiencies in traditional utility markets. Other energy companies found themselves subject to increased scrutiny and skepticism from investors, regulators, and the public, leading to more conservative business practices and greater transparency in financial reporting. The scandal effectively ended the era of aggressive financial engineering in the energy sector and ushered in a period of more traditional business models focused on actual energy production and delivery, rather than financial speculation. The educational initiatives that emerged from the scandal included not only formal academic programs but also public awareness campaigns designed to help investors better understand financial statements and identify potential red flags. Organizations such as the Securities and Exchange Commission and various investor advocacy groups develop materials to help ordinary investors recognize signs of potential fraud and understand their rights when investing in public companies. These educational efforts represented a recognition that preventing future scandals would require not only stronger regulation but also more informed and vigilant investors. The international implications of the Enron scandal extended far beyond the borders of the United States, as foreign investors who had purchased Enron stock or bonds also suffered significant losses. The scandal raised questions about the adequacy of international cooperation in securities regulation and led to enhanced information sharing agreements between regulatory agencies in different countries. The collapse also influenced regulatory reforms in other nations, as governments sought to ensure that their own financial markets would not be vulnerable to similar types of fraud. The long-term career consequences for individuals associated with the scandal varied widely depending on their level of involvement and the specific roles they had played. Some former Enron employees who had not been involved in fraudulent activities were eventually able to rebuild successful careers in the energy industry or other fields, while others found that their association with the company continued to limit their employment opportunities for years. The scandal created a new category of professional reputation risk, as employers became more cautious about hiring individuals who had worked for companies involved in major fraud cases. The development of new financial instruments and risk management techniques in the years following the scandal reflected lessons learned from Enron's collapse about the importance of transparency and accountability in complex financial transactions. Financial institutions began implementing more rigorous due diligence procedures for structured finance products, while regulators developed new frameworks for evaluating and monitoring off-balance sheet arrangements. These changes represented a fundamental shift toward greater conservatism and transparency in financial markets. The impact of the scandal on pension and retirement systems was particularly profound, as the losses suffered by Enron employees highlighted the risks associated with concentrated investments in employer stock. Many companies revised their 401k plans to provide greater diversification opportunities and to limit the percentage of retirement assets that could be invested in company stock. These changes were designed to ensure that future retirees would not face the same devastating losses that had affected so many Enron employees. As we approach the conclusion of this extensive examination of the aftermath, we can see how the human cost of corporate fraud extends across generations, affecting not only the immediate victims but also their children and grandchildren who inherit the consequences of financial devastation. Children whose college educations were interrupted by their parents' losses from Enron's collapse carried those impacts forward into their own adult lives, while elderly victims who were forced to delay retirement or return to work after losing their savings experienced health problems and reduced quality of life that lasted for years. The transformation of Arthur Andersen from a respected professional services firm to a cautionary tale about the dangers of compromised independence serves as perhaps the most dramatic illustration of how institutional reputation, built over decades, can be destroyed in a matter of months when ethical standards are abandoned. The firm's collapse eliminated tens of thousands of jobs and disrupted audit relationships with hundreds of public companies, creating additional costs and complications throughout the business community as companies were forced to find new auditors and rebuild professional relationships. And so, dear listeners, as this comprehensive examination of the aftermath draws toward its close, we prepare to explore how the lessons learned from this devastating episode would continue to influence American business, regulation, and society for decades to come. The human cost of corporate fraud, measured not only in financial terms but in broken trust, shattered careers, and damaged communities, would serve as a constant reminder of the importance of ethical leadership and effective oversight. As we transition into our final exploration of this remarkable story, we shall discover how the legacy of Enron's lies would ultimately contribute to a stronger, more transparent, and more accountable system of corporate governance that better serves the interests of all stakeholders in American capitalism. And so as we near the end of this sleep story, we find ourselves in the quiet aftermath of one of America's greatest corporate collapses, where the dust had settled over the ruins of Enron. But the reverberations of its fall continued to echo through the halls of Congress, the boardrooms of corporations across the nation, and the very foundations of how America would regulate its financial markets for generations to come. The year 2002 dawned with a country still reeling from the magnitude of what had transpired, and in the somber chambers of the United States Capitol, lawmakers understood that they faced a moment of reckoning, a crossroads where they could either restore faith in the American financial system or watch as investor confidence crumbled like autumn leaves in the wind. This bedtime story of corporate malfeasance had awakened something profound in the American consciousness, a recognition that the very systems designed to protect investors, employees, and the public trust had failed in spectacular fashion, leaving behind a landscape littered with broken promises, shattered dreams, and the urgent need for reform. Senator Paul Sarbanes of Maryland, a soft-spoken Democrat with silver hair and the measured demeanor of a long-time public servant, found himself at the center of what would become one of the most significant pieces of financial legislation in American history. His office, overlooking the bustling streets of Washington, became a sanctuary where the complex work of rebuilding trust would begin. One carefully crafted provision at a time, across the Capitol, Representative Michael Oxley of Ohio, a Republican with a background in business and law, shared Sarbanes' understanding that partisan politics had no place in the urgent work of corporate governance reform. Together, these two men from different parties would forge a bipartisan alliance that would fundamentally reshape how American corporations would operate, report their finances, and answer to their shareholders in the decades to come. The legislation they would craft, known to history as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, emerged from countless hours of testimony, investigation, and careful deliberation. Like a master craftsman slowly shaping a piece of wood, each provision was carved with precision, each requirement designed to address the specific vulnerabilities that Enron had so ruthlessly exploited in its rise and catastrophic fall. As this calming story for deep sleep unfolds in these final chapters, we witness how the very nature of corporate accountability was reimagined. Where once there had been shadows and opacity, the new law would demand transparency. Where once there had been unchecked executive power, there would now be oversight and verification. Where once accounting firms could operate with conflicts of interest, clear boundaries would be drawn in permanent ink. The heart of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act beat with a simple yet revolutionary premise. The corporate executives must personally certify the accuracy of their company's financial statements, signing their names to documents that, if false, could send them to federal prison for decades. This was no longer a world where CEOs could claim ignorance of their company's true financial condition, where they could hide behind layers of bureaucracy and legal protection when the numbers proved to be fabrications. Section 302 of the Act created what became known as the CEO certification requirement, a provision that would forever change the relationship between corporate leadership and financial reporting. Under this gentle but firm hand of regulation, chief executive officers and chief financial officers would be required to personally vouch for the accuracy and completeness of their quarterly and annual reports, acknowledging that they had reviewed the documents, that they contained no material misstatements, and that they fairly represented the company's financial condition. The penalties for violating these certifications were severe enough to make even the most ambitious executive pause in contemplation. Fines of up to $1 million and prison sentences of up to 10 years awaited those who knowingly certified false statements, while even more serious consequences, including fines of up to $5 million and 20 years in prison, would fall upon those who willfully violated the certification requirements. But the Sarbanes-Oxley Act reached far deeper than executive certification, extending its protective embrace to encompass the very foundations of corporate governance. Section 404, perhaps the most complex and far-reaching provision of the entire law, required companies to establish and maintain internal controls over financial reporting, creating comprehensive systems designed to prevent the kind of accounting manipulation that had allowed Enron to hide its debt, inflate its revenues, and mislead investors for years. These internal controls became like the immune system of the corporate body, constantly monitoring, checking, and verifying that financial information flowed through the organization with accuracy and integrity. Companies would be required to test these controls annually, to document their effectiveness, and to have external auditors verify that the controls were operating as designed, creating multiple layers of verification that would make it exponentially more difficult for future Enrons to emerge from the shadows. The Act also transformed the relationship between corporations and their auditors, addressing one of the most troubling aspects of the Enron scandal, the cozy, profitable relationship between Enron and Arthur Andersen that had compromised the independence so essential to effective auditing. Under the new regime of financial regulation, accounting firms would be prohibited from providing certain non-audit services to their audit clients, eliminating the conflicts of interest that had turned auditors from watchdogs into enablers. A new entity, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, would emerge as the guardian of audit quality and independence. This board, with the authority to inspect, investigate, and discipline accounting firms, would ensure that the profession maintained the standards necessary to protect the investing public. No longer would self-regulation be sufficient. No longer would the accounting industry police itself without external oversight. No longer would firms be able to prioritize consulting fees over audit integrity. As our relaxing history narrative continues through these transformative years, we observe how the Sarbanes-Oxley Act addressed the specific techniques that Enron had used to deceive investors and regulators. The creation of special purpose entities, those shadowy off-balance sheet partnerships that had hidden billions in debt, would face new disclosure requirements and consolidation rules that would bring them into the light of transparency. Executive compensation, particularly stock options that had incentivized the short-term thinking and aggressive accounting that characterized Enron's final years, would face new disclosure requirements and restrictions. The Act required companies to provide detailed information about executive compensation packages, including stock options, and established rules designed to prevent executives from timing their stock sales to take advantage of inside information. The legislation also created new protections for corporate whistleblowers, recognizing that employees like Sharon Watkins, who had tried to warn of Enron's accounting irregularities, needed legal protection from retaliation. Companies would be prohibited from firing, demoting, or otherwise punishing employees who reported suspected violations of securities laws, creating a pathway for truth to emerge even when corporate leadership preferred silence. Section 806 of the Act established criminal penalties for anyone who retaliated against whistleblowers, with fines and prison sentences of up to 10 years, awaiting those who sought to silence employees trying to protect investors and the public interest. This provision transformed the corporate culture around reporting irregularities, encouraging employees to speak up when they witnessed questionable practices rather than remaining silent out of fear for their careers. The implementation of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was not without its challenges. As this sleep story of corporate transformation unfolds, we see how companies across America struggled to adapt to the new requirements, spending billions of dollars to establish the internal controls, documentation, and verification systems that the law demanded. Small companies, in particular, found themselves bearing disproportionate costs as they worked to comply with regulations designed primarily with large public corporations in mind. Critics argued that the Act went too far, that it stifled innovation and competitiveness by imposing excessive regulatory burdens on American businesses. They pointed to the costs of compliance, the time spent on documentation and verification, the risk-averse culture that emerged as executives became personally liable for their company's financial reporting. Some suggested that the Act made American markets less attractive to foreign companies seeking to list their shares, potentially driving business to less regulated exchanges in London or Hong Kong. Supporters countered that these costs were a necessary price to pay for restored investor confidence. They noted that the Act had largely succeeded in its primary goal of preventing another Enron, that financial reporting had become more reliable and transparent, that investors could once again trust that the numbers presented in corporate financial statements bore some resemblance to reality. The occasional accounting scandals that emerged after Sarbanes-Oxley were quickly detected and addressed, a sharp contrast to the years of deception that had characterized the Enron era. As the years passed, The Enron legacy became embedded in the very fabric of American corporate governance. Business schools began teaching courses dedicated to corporate ethics and responsibility, using the Enron case as a cautionary tale about the consequences of prioritizing short-term profits over long-term sustainability. Students learned about the importance of internal controls, the dangers of conflicts of interest, and the personal responsibility that comes with corporate leadership. The phrase Enron-like behavior entered the business lexicon as shorthand for accounting manipulation, executive excess, and corporate irresponsibility. When companies engaged in questionable practices, regulators, investors, and journalists would invoke Enron's name as a warning, a reminder of how quickly corporate empires built on deception could crumble, and how devastating the consequences could be for employees, investors, and the broader economy. This bedtime story of corporate accountability reveals how the Sarbanes-Oxley Act became more than just a piece of legislation. It represented a fundamental shift in how America thought about the relationship between corporations and society, between private enterprise and public trust. The Act acknowledged that corporations, particularly large public companies, held a special responsibility to the investors who provided their capital, the employees who depended on them for their livelihoods, and the communities in which they operated. The certification requirements that seemed so burdensome to some executives served a deeper purpose. They restored the personal accountability that had been lost in the complexity of modern corporate structures. When a CEO signed the certification, they were not merely completing a regulatory requirement. They were accepting personal responsibility for the accuracy of their company's financial reporting, acknowledging that their signature represented a promise to shareholders and the investing public. The internal controls mandated by Section 404, while expensive and time-consuming to implement, created a culture of verification and documentation that made it far more difficult for accounting irregularities to go undetected. Companies developed sophisticated systems for monitoring financial reporting, training employees to recognize and report potential problems, and ensuring that information flowed accurately through the organization from subsidiary to parent company. From operating division to corporate headquarters, the transformation of the auditing profession, while painful for firms like Arthur Andersen that had built their business models around providing multiple services to their clients, ultimately strengthened the independence and credibility of external audits. Auditors could once again focus on their primary responsibility of verifying financial statements, without the distraction of consulting, relationships that might compromise their objectivity. As our calming story for deep sleep draws toward its conclusion, we observe how the Sarbanes-Oxley Act influenced corporate governance far beyond the borders of the United States. Countries around the world studied the American response to Enron and similar scandals, adapting elements of the Sarbanes-Oxley approach to their own regulatory frameworks. The Act became a model for how nations could respond to corporate scandals and restore confidence in their financial markets. The European Union developed its own enhanced corporate governance requirements, drawing inspiration from the American experience while adapting the rules to fit European legal and business traditions. Asian markets, recognizing the importance of investor confidence in attracting international capital, implemented similar reforms designed to improve transparency and accountability in their public companies. This global spread of corporate governance reform represented perhaps the most lasting element of the Enron legacy, the recognition that in an interconnected world economy, corporate scandals in one country could undermine confidence in markets everywhere, and that strong governance standards were not a luxury but a necessity for any nation seeking to participate in global capital markets. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act also transformed the relationship between corporations and their shareholders, empowering investors with better information and stronger protections. Shareholder activism increased as investors gained confidence that corporate financial statements were reliable and that they had legal recourse if they discovered deception. Institutional investors, managing pension funds and mutual funds for millions of Americans, became more engaged in corporate governance, using their voting power to influence executive compensation, board composition, and corporate strategy. The Act's whistleblower protections, while not perfect, created a pathway for employees to report corporate wrongdoing without fear of retaliation. Over the years, numerous corporate scandals were uncovered by brave employees who followed Sharon Watkins' example, speaking truth to power even when it threatened their careers. These whistleblowers became heroes of corporate accountability, their courage helping to prevent countless investors from falling victim to corporate deception. As this relaxing history narrative reaches its final chapters, we see how the Sarbanes-Oxley Act evolved and adapted over time. Subsequent amendments and regulatory guidance address some of the initial implementation challenges, reducing costs for smaller companies while maintaining the core protections that had restored confidence in financial reporting. The Act proved to be a living document, capable of evolution while maintaining its fundamental principles. The creation of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board marked a permanent change in how the accounting profession would operate. The board's inspections of accounting firms, its investigations of audit failures, and its disciplinary actions against firms and individual auditors created a culture of accountability that had been missing during the Enron era. Auditors knew that their work would be subject to scrutiny, that substandard performance could result in professional sanctions, and that their primary duty was to the investing public rather than to the corporate clients, who paid their fees. The Enron legacy also influenced how corporations thought about risk management and internal controls. Companies developed sophisticated enterprise risk management programs designed to identify and address potential problems before they could threaten the organization's survival. These programs went far beyond financial reporting, encompassing operational risks, strategic risks, and reputational risks that could affect shareholder value and stakeholder confidence. Corporate boards of directors, once often seen as ceremonial bodies that rubber-stamped management decisions, became more engaged and independent. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act strengthened audit committee requirements, mandating that these committees be composed of independent directors with financial expertise. Board meetings became more substantive, with directors asking harder questions and demanding better information about corporate performance and risk management. The Act's influence extended to executive education and development. Business schools and executive education programs expanded their curricula to include courses on corporate governance, ethics, and risk management. Future corporate leaders learned not just about maximizing shareholder value, but about their broader responsibilities to stakeholders and society. The Enron case became a standard part of this education, ensuring that each new generation of business leaders understood the consequences of corporate irresponsibility. As we near the end of this sleep story, we observe how the Sarbanes-Oxley Act became embedded in the daily operations of American corporations. Compliance officers, once rare in corporate hierarchies, became essential members of management teams, responsible for ensuring that companies adhered to the complex web of regulations designed to protect investors and maintain market integrity. These officers served as internal guardians of corporate governance, helping to prevent the kind of rule-bending and corner-cutting that had characterized Enron's final years. The Act also changed how corporate information flowed to investors and the public. The enhanced disclosure requirements meant that companies had to provide more detailed and frequent information about their operations, financial condition, and risk factors. This transparency allowed investors to make more informed decisions and helped prevent the kind of information asymmetry that had allowed Enron to mislead investors for so long. The certification requirements created a new dynamic in corporate leadership. CEOs and CFOs could no longer claim ignorance of their company's financial condition or delegate responsibility for financial reporting to subordinates. The personal liability associated with certification meant that executives had powerful incentives to ensure that their company's financial reporting systems were robust and reliable. The transformation of the auditing relationship, while initially disruptive, ultimately strengthened the quality of financial reporting. Auditors, freed from conflicts of interest created by consulting relationships, could focus on their core mission of providing independent verification of corporate financial statements. The enhanced oversight provided by the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board ensured that audit quality remained high and that any deficiencies were quickly identified and addressed. As this calming story for deep sleep draws to its close, we reflect on how the Sarbanes-Oxley Act represented more than just a regulatory response to a corporate scandal. It embodied a renewed commitment to the principles of transparency, accountability, and integrity that form the foundation of American capitalism. The Act acknowledged that markets work best when investors can trust the information they receive, when corporate leaders are held accountable for their decisions, and when there are consequences for those who would abuse the public trust. The Enron legacy serves as a permanent reminder of the importance of corporate governance and the dangers of unchecked ambition. The company that once dominated Houston's skyline and America's energy markets now exists only in history books and business school case studies, a cautionary tale about the inevitable consequences of building a business on deception and accounting gimmicks rather than sustainable value creation. The thousands of Enron employees who lost their jobs and retirement savings, the investors who saw their portfolios devastated, and the communities that depended on Enron's economic activity all paid a price for the company's deception. Their suffering was not in vain if it led to reforms that prevented future generations from experiencing similar losses, if it created a corporate culture more focused on sustainable value creation than short-term financial engineering. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, born from the ashes of Enron and other corporate scandals of the early 2000s, stands as a testament to America's ability to learn from its mistakes and adapt its institutions to meet new challenges. While the act was not perfect and its implementation was sometimes costly and burdensome, it succeeded in its primary mission of restoring confidence in American financial markets and corporate governance. And so, as this bedtime story of corporate rise and fall reaches its conclusion, we are reminded that the true measure of any society lies not in its ability to prevent all failures, but in its capacity to learn from those failures and build stronger, more resilient institutions. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act represents that learning, that growth, that commitment to continuous improvement that has long characterized the American approach to economic governance. The legacy of Enron lives are not in the company's spectacular collapse, but in the reforms that collapse made possible, in the stronger corporate governance standards that protect investors, in the enhanced accountability that governs corporate leadership, and in the renewed commitment to transparency and integrity that guides American business today. This sleep story of transformation and renewal reminds us that even from the deepest corporate failures, positive change can emerge, that the American system's greatest strength lies not in its perfection, but in its ability to acknowledge mistakes, learn from them, and build a better future for all who depend on the integrity of our financial markets and corporate institutions. In the quiet years that followed the implementation of these sweeping reforms, a new generation of corporate leaders emerged, men and women who had learned the lessons of Enron not from textbooks, but from the living memory of what happens when corporations lose their way. When the pursuit of profit becomes disconnected from the creation of genuine value, when the temptation to manipulate numbers overcomes the commitment to honest reporting, these leaders operated in a world transformed by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, where every quarterly earnings report carried the weight of personal certification, where internal control systems hummed quietly in the background of daily operations like the steady heartbeat of corporate accountability, where audit committees met not as ceremonial gatherings, but as serious deliberative bodies charged with protecting shareholder interests. The compliance culture that emerged from this regulatory transformation was not without its critics. Some argued that American business had become too cautious, too focused on checking boxes and following procedures rather than innovating and taking the calculated risks necessary for economic growth. They pointed to the millions of hours spent documenting internal controls, the armies of compliance officers hired to navigate regulatory requirements, the quarterly certification rituals that consumed executive time and attention. Yet as this relaxing history narrative unfolds through these transformed years, we observe how the new corporate governance framework proved its worth during subsequent economic challenges. When the financial crisis of 2008 tested American markets and institutions, the enhanced transparency and accountability measures implemented after Enron helped investors and regulators identify problems more quickly, respond more effectively, and maintain greater confidence in the fundamental integrity of financial reporting. The banks and financial institutions that failed during that crisis fell victim to excessive risk-taking and poor judgment, but they did not collapse because of the kind of systematic accounting fraud that had characterized Enron. The Sarbanes-Oxley framework, while it could not prevent all corporate failures, had largely eliminated the specific vulnerabilities that Enron had exploited so devastatingly. Corporate boards, transformed by the independence requirements and enhanced oversight responsibilities mandated by the Act, became more effective guardians of shareholder interests. Directors could no longer serve merely as prestigious figureheads, rubber-stamping management decisions in comfortable boardroom settings. They faced real legal liability for their oversight failures, genuine responsibility for the companies they governed, and the expectation that they would ask difficult questions and demand honest answers. The enhanced disclosure requirements created a new rhythm in corporate communications. Quarterly earnings calls became more detailed and substantive. Annual reports provided deeper insights into corporate strategy and risk management, and the constant flow of required disclosures kept investors better informed about material developments affecting their investments. This transformation of corporate communications represented more than just regulatory compliance. It reflected a fundamental shift in how companies thought about their relationship with investors and the broader public. Transparency became not just a legal requirement, but a competitive advantage, as companies that communicated clearly and honestly found it easier to attract capital, retain talent, and build sustainable business relationships. The auditing profession, initially resistant to the constraints imposed by Sarbanes-Oxley, gradually adapted to its new role as truly independent verifier of corporate financial statements. The prohibition on consulting services, while painful for firms that had built profitable advisory practices, ultimately strengthened the credibility and effectiveness of the audit function. Auditors could once again focus on their core mission without the conflicts of interest that had compromised their independence during the Enron era. The public company accounting oversight board settled into its role as guardian of audit quality. Its regular inspections of accounting firms, detailed reviews of audit procedures, and public reports on deficiencies created a culture of continuous improvement in audit practice. The board's disciplinary actions against firms and individual auditors who failed to meet professional standards sent clear signals about the consequences of substandard performance. As our sleep story of institutional transformation continues, we see how the Sarbanes-Oxley Act influenced corporate culture in ways both subtle and profound. The personal certification requirements changed how executives thought about their responsibilities, creating a direct line of accountability from the CEO's signature to every transaction recorded in the company's books. This personal liability focused executive attention on the quality and reliability of financial reporting systems in ways that abstract corporate responsibility never could. The internal controls mandated by Section 404, while costly and complex to implement, created systematic approaches to risk management and financial oversight that many companies found valuable beyond mere regulatory compliance. These controls helped identify operational inefficiencies, prevent fraud and errors, and provide management with better information about business, performance, and potential problems. The whistleblower protections embedded in the Act gradually transformed corporate cultures. Around the reporting of irregularities, employees became more willing to raise concerns about questionable practices, knowing that they had legal protection against retaliation. Companies developed formal channels for reporting concerns, investigation procedures for addressing allegations, and cultural norms that encouraged transparency and accountability throughout the organization. This transformation was not immediate or universal. Changing deeply embedded corporate cultures required years of consistent effort, training programs that emphasized ethical behavior, performance evaluation systems that rewarded integrity alongside financial results, and leadership that modeled the behavior expected. Throughout the organization, the business schools and executive education programs that trained future corporate leaders incorporated the lessons of Enron into their core curricula. Case studies examined not just what went wrong at Enron, but how the regulatory and cultural changes that followed had strengthened American capitalism. Students learned about the importance of sustainable business models, the dangers of excessive leverage and off-balance sheet financing, and the critical role that accurate financial reporting plays in efficient capital allocation. These educational efforts created a generation of business leaders who understood corporate governance not as a constraint on business success, but as a foundation for sustainable value creation. They recognized that investor confidence, employee loyalty, and stakeholder trust were valuable corporate assets that required careful cultivation and protection. The international influence of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act extended far beyond American borders. Countries around the world studied the American response to corporate scandals and adapted elements of the approach to their own regulatory frameworks. The European Union's enhanced corporate governance requirements, Asia's strengthened disclosure standards, and Latin America's improved auditing oversight all bore the influence of the American experience with Enron and the regulatory response that followed. This global spread of corporate governance reform created a more level playing field for international investors. Companies seeking to access global capital markets found that strong governance standards were not optional, but essential for attracting institutional investment. The race to the bottom in regulatory standards that some had feared gave way to a race to the top as countries competed to offer the most transparent and reliable investment environments. As opposed, this calming story for deep sleep moves through these years of gradual institutional strengthening. We observe how the memory of Enron served as a continuing reminder of the importance of corporate integrity. When companies faced ethical dilemmas or regulatory gray areas, the specter of Enron's collapse provided a powerful incentive to choose transparency over opacity, substance over form, long-term value creation over short-term financial engineering. The quarterly certification ritual, initially seen by many executives as merely another regulatory burden, evolved into a meaningful governance practice. The process of reviewing financial statements, assessing internal controls, and signing personal certifications forced executives to engage more deeply with their company's financial reporting, to understand the assumptions and judgments underlying the numbers, and to take personal responsibility for the accuracy and completeness of investor disclosures. The enhanced audit committee requirements transformed these once ceremonial bodies into effective oversight mechanisms. Committee members, required to have financial expertise and independence from management, could ask informed questions about accounting treatments, internal control deficiencies, and audit findings. Their regular meetings with external auditors, conducted without management present, created opportunities for auditors to raise concerns that might otherwise go unaddressed. The transformation of corporate risk management represented another lasting legacy of the Enron era. Companies developed sophisticated enterprise risk management frameworks designed to identify, assess, and mitigate risks that could threaten business objectives or stakeholder interests. These frameworks went far beyond financial reporting to encompass operational risks, strategic risks, compliance risks, and reputational risks that could affect long-term value creation. The integration of risk management into corporate governance created more resilient organizations. Boards received regular reports on risk exposures and mitigation strategies. Management developed systematic approaches to risk assessment and response, and companies built organizational capabilities for managing uncertainty and change. As our bedtime story of corporate transformation approaches its final passages, we reflect on how the Sarbanes-Oxley Act represented more than just a response to a single corporate scandal. It embodied a broader commitment to the principles that make market economies work effectively: transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. The Act acknowledged that corporate failures like Enron impose costs not just on direct stakeholders but on the entire economic system. When investors lose confidence in financial reporting, capital becomes more expensive and harder to obtain. When employees lose faith in corporate leadership, productivity and innovation suffer. When communities lose trust in business institutions, the social contract that supports market economies becomes strained. The regulatory framework created in response to Enron helped rebuild this trust by establishing clear rules, meaningful penalties, and systematic oversight. Companies that followed these rules could compete for capital and talent on the basis of their actual performance, rather than their ability to manipulate financial statements. Investors could make informed decisions based on reliable information rather than guessing about the true financial condition of public companies. The personal responsibility embedded in the certification requirements restored a human dimension to corporate accountability. When executives signed their names to financial statements, they were not hiding behind corporate legal structures or delegating responsibility to subordinates. They were accepting personal liability for the accuracy of investor disclosures, creating powerful incentives for honest reporting and effective internal controls. The independence requirements for auditors and board members reduced conflicts of interest that had compromised oversight effectiveness. Auditors could focus on their verification responsibilities without worrying about consulting revenue from audit clients. Directors could exercise independent judgment without undue influence from management or other business relationships. The enhanced disclosure requirements provided investors with better information for making investment decisions. Companies had to reveal more about their operations, financial condition, risk factors, and management compensation, allowing investors to assess opportunities and risks more accurately. This transparency improved capital allocation efficiency and reduced the information advantages. that insiders had historically enjoyed over outside investors. As this sleep story of institutional renewal draws toward its peaceful conclusion, we recognize that the true measure of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act lies not in its perfect prevention of all corporate failures, but in its success at addressing the specific vulnerabilities that Enron had exploited. The act made systematic accounting fraud much more difficult to perpetrate and much easier to detect, restored personal accountability to corporate leadership, and created oversight mechanisms that could identify problems before they threatened the stability of the entire financial system. The legacy of Enron thus became not just a cautionary tale about corporate excess, but a foundation for institutional reform. The company's spectacular collapse catalyzed changes that strengthened American capitalism, improved investor protection, and enhanced corporate accountability. The pain experienced by Enron's stakeholders was not in vain if it led to reforms that prevented future generations from experiencing similar losses. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act stands as a testament to the American system's capacity for self-correction and improvement. When confronted with clear evidence that existing institutions and regulations were inadequate, the country responded with comprehensive reforms designed to address identified weaknesses while preserving the fundamental strengths of market-based capitalism. This balance between reform and continuity represented perhaps the greatest achievement of the post-Enron regulatory response. The changes were significant enough to address the problems that had enabled corporate scandals, but not so radical as to undermine the entrepreneurial energy and innovation that drive economic growth. And so, as this relaxing history narrative reaches its natural conclusion, we are left with the understanding that the Enron story is ultimately about more than one company's rise and fall. It is about the ongoing evolution of American capitalism, the continuous process of learning and adaptation that has long characterized the country's approach to economic governance. The buildings that once housed Enron's headquarters have been repurposed for other uses. The company's logo no longer adorns Houston's skyline. Its executives have served their prison sentences or faded into obscurity, and its financial statements have become historical artifacts studied by accounting, students, and business historians. But the institutional changes sparked by Enron's collapse continue to shape American business today. Every quarterly certification signed by a corporate executive, every internal control test performed by a company's accounting team, every independent audit conducted by a public accounting firm, every board meeting where directors exercise meaningful oversight carries forward the lessons learned from that company's spectacular failure. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, born from the ashes of corporate scandal, has become a permanent feature of American corporate governance. A reminder that trust, once lost, must be rebuilt through patient effort and sustained commitment to transparency, accountability, and integrity. This is the true legacy of Enron, not the company that fell, but the stronger institutions that rose from its collapse. Not the trust that was betrayed, but the mechanisms created to rebuild and maintain that trust for generations to come. As we close this chapter of American business history, we carry with us the knowledge that even from the deepest institutional failures, positive change can emerge. Then the American system's greatest strength lies not in its perfection, but in its capacity to acknowledge mistakes, learn from them, and build a better foundation for future prosperity and growth. And in the quiet confidence of reformed institutions and strengthened governance, in the steady rhythm of certified financial statements and independent audits, in the patient work of oversight and accountability that continues each business day across America, the true measure of this transformation reveals itself, not in grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements, but in the daily practice of corporate responsibility and the gradual rebuilding of trust between business and society. This bedtime story of corporate transformation reminds us that progress often comes not through revolution, but through the accumulation of small improvements, the gradual strengthening of institutions, and the patient work of ensuring that the lessons of the past inform the decisions of the future, creating a more trustworthy, more accountable, and more sustainable foundation for American business and the millions of people whose livelihoods and retirement security depend on its continued integrity and success. And so, my dear friend, we reach the end of our journey through one of corporate America's most profound tales of rise and fall. This sleep story has carried us from the bustling energy markets of 1980s Houston to the quiet chambers where new laws were written, from the dizzying heights of stock market success to the sobering depths of financial collapse and personal reckoning. The Enron scandal stands as a timeless reminder that in business, as in life, there are no shortcuts to genuine success, that sustainable prosperity must be built on foundations of truth rather than elaborate deceptions, that corporate governance exists not as a burden, but as a protection for all who place their trust in public companies. Through this relaxing history narrative, we have witnessed how hubris and deception, no matter how cleverly constructed, ultimately carry within them the seeds of their own destruction, and how from even the most devastating corporate failures, wisdom can emerge to strengthen the institutions upon which our economic well-being depends. The lessons of Enron echo quietly through boardrooms and regulatory offices to this day, a gentle but persistent reminder that transparency, accountability, and integrity remain the true pillars of lasting business success, and that those who forget these principles do so at their own peril. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey through the archives, for lending your attention to this tale of transformation and renewal. May you carry with you the understanding that even in our imperfect world, the capacity for learning, growth, and positive change remains ever present.